Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Hannah Blake. I'm 29 years old. This happened in late October of 2023 when I traveled alone to Mohawk Trail State Forest in the Berkshires of western Massachusetts. I'm sharing every detail of what I experienced, even though I know how unbelievable it may sound. Every time I try to tell someone in person, I see the doubt in their eyes. So here it is, raw and unfiltered. This is the truth of what happened to me, my sister, and my dog, Jasper. I'd been planning the trip for weeks. After a messy breakup, I needed to clear my head and put some distance between myself and the city. My original idea was to camp solo for 2 nights, do some nature photography, and blog about the experience. I'd done a handful of camping trips before, though I certainly wouldn't call myself a survival expert. I'm a travel blogger, an amateur photographer, not a hardcore hiker. But I trusted myself enough to navigate well-marked trails, and I figured Jasper, my 3-year-old Labrador, would be more than enough company. When I first arrived at Mohawk Trail State Forest, the sun was still high, and the leaves wore their spectacular autumn colors, vibrant oranges, reds, and yellows that set the entire woodland aflame. I remember thinking how lucky I was to catch peak foliage season. As I walked to my initial campsite, Jasper bounded excitedly at my side, sniffing every rock and patch of grass. He was always good for morale. If not for him, I might have felt uneasy about the growing silence in the air. The distant hum of cars on a nearby highway gradually faded with each step, leaving us alone with the rustle of leaves. I set up my small 2-person tent on a patch of level ground near a quiet stream. The sunlight filtered through the branches in flickering patterns. It was almost soothing. I took a dozen pictures of the trees, the water, even some selfies with Jasper wagging his tail. My plan was to move deeper into the forest the next day, sleeping 2 nights in different locations, then heading back on the 3rd morning. The first sign of trouble was small and innocuous enough that I probably wouldn't have noticed it if I wasn't so attached to my phone. Around dusk, I tried to check the time, but my phone's battery icon showed a big red 0. I'd charged it fully an hour before starting my hike. I shrugged. Maybe it was just a glitch. I powered the phone down and tucked it away, deciding I'd rely on my watch for the time and my paper map for navigation. Ironically, I felt a surge of pride in leaving the phone behind, as if that made me more of a real outdoors woman. The night came quickly. Leaves fell in soft flutters. Crickets and owls traded calls in the distance. I felt an excited nervousness about the silence. It was the kind of hush you learn to appreciate when escaping city chaos. I lit a small campfire to cook dinner. Jasper curled up at my feet, muzzle on his paws. Once darkness settled, I realized how alone we were. I fed Jasper a handful of treats before munching on my freeze-dried meal. The first hour by the fire was peaceful. Eventually, though, I noticed the flames seemed oddly tinted, a little more blue than orange. I prodded the logs with a stick. Sparks flew upward, but the color didn't change. Could have been a reaction from chemicals in the wood, I told myself. Probably not a big deal. Sometime near midnight, I went to my tent. Jasper hopped inside without a fuss, curling up at the foot of my sleeping bag. I felt a moment of pure comfort, that sense of being protected by my dog. I quickly drifted off to sleep. When morning came, I awoke to a strange feeling that the sleeping bag was loose around me. I reached for the zipper and found it wide open, unzipped from the inside. Jasper was gone. The tent flap was closed, but he wasn't in the tent at all. Confused, I stuck my head out, calling his name. I could see my breath in the cold morning air. The campfire was nothing but ash. My phone was dead. My watch read 6:45 a.m., which seemed normal, but I could have sworn it had been earlier based on the dim light. I found Jasper's paw prints leading toward the tree line. The footprints vanished in a swirl of leaves. I called again. Silence. Fear started gnawing at my gut. I'd had him since he was a puppy. He'd never just run off. Clambering out, I grabbed my boots, tossed on my coat, and went searching. A few minutes later, just when I began to panic, Jasper trotted back from behind a boulder, wagging his tail as though nothing had happened. His fur was damp, and he had dirt stuck to his legs. He must have gone exploring near the stream. I scolded him softly, but I was more relieved than angry. I told myself, next time, tie him up or keep a better watch. No big deal. Then I noticed the sky overhead was brighter than before, more like late morning than early. My watch still read 6:45 a.m. Great, I muttered. The watch must be broken too. Electronic devices get glitchy sometimes, right? But it wasn't a digital watch, it was analog, purely mechanical. I shook it. Nothing changed. After breakfast, I decided to push deeper into the forest, to a more remote spot I'd heard about near a ridge. Hiking the forest trails was gorgeous at first. Jasper was in high spirits, and I tried to mimic his enthusiasm. The day passed quickly. The deeper in we went, the fewer hikers we ran into. A couple of folks with heavy packs, a pair of older women with trekking poles, that was about it. By the time we reached the next location, a secluded clearing near a small pond, it was late afternoon. I took out my phone, hoping it might magically have some charge left to snap photos. Still dead, I gave up and relied on my actual camera, a little mirrorless I'd brought along, which was thankfully still working. The pond looked peaceful, ringed by pine trees that soared skyward. The reflection of the setting sun on the water was mesmerizing, so I snapped a few shots for my blog. I set up the tent while there was still daylight. The sky started to glow with those deep pink and orange shades, so I hurried to gather firewood. Leaves crunched underfoot. The cool air had an almost metallic edge to it. I tried to keep track of my steps back to camp, but the environment felt disorienting, like the same cluster of pine trees repeated themselves in every direction, doubling or tripling. I counted 5 paces in one direction, but after another 10 I was sure I should have been back already. Then I remembered the area had mild hills and ridges, enough to confuse an untrained eye. Eventually, I spotted my tent and dropped the small bundle of wood by the fire ring I'd fashioned out of stones. Jasper was quiet. Instead of bounding around, he sat stock still, ears perked and eyes fixed on the thickening trees beyond the tent. He let out a low rumble, more a vibration than a bark. Something unsettled him. After we had a fire going, I tried to laugh off the tension. I even told Jasper, "Hey buddy, you gotta chill, or I'll start hearing ghosts too." The minute I said ghosts, a chill ran down my spine. The flames danced in an erratic pattern, as though responding to a breeze, but there wasn't any wind. I stared at them, trying to quell the rising anxiety. Night fell, and with it came a hush so complete that I felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath. No owls, no crickets, no leaves rustling. Just silence, and the crackle of the fire, and my own heartbeat. Around 9, by my watch's useless face, I heard Jasper whining. He stood up, hackles raised, staring into a wall of darkness. I aimed my flashlight there, but nothing was visible except pine trunks and undergrowth. My fingertips tingled with that peculiar electricity you feel when something is about to go wrong. I decided it was best to turn in for the night, keep Jasper close. The tent felt safer, though I wasn't entirely sure why. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a loud snap of a branch right beside the tent. Jasper erupted in frantic barking. I sat up, fumbling for the zipper. My heart pounded so violently it almost drowned out the bark. Outside, the fire had dimmed to coals, painting the clearing in a faint orange glow. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, uneven footsteps. I flicked on my flashlight, shining it through the tent's mesh window. I expected maybe a bear or a lost hiker. Instead, I saw the silhouette of a woman standing at the tree line, wearing what looked like a long dress or nightgown. She seemed pale, or at least her clothes did, in that half-lit darkness. But she made no sound, just stared in my direction. Maybe she was in shock or lost. "Hello?" I called, voice trembling. "Are you okay?" She stepped backward, vanishing among the pines with unnatural silence. Jasper whined, then barked once more. I wasn't sure what to do. We waited, me perched half out of the tent, but no sign of her. If she was a real person, she vanished too quickly, like a ghost or a dream. I decided to zip up the tent again and wait until morning. I had no intention of chasing after some random figure in the middle of the night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep, still fully dressed with a trembling dog beside me. Dawn came, or at least a lighter shade of gray. The sky was overcast, thick with clouds that threatened rain. My watch still read 6:45 a.m., refusing to move forward. When I got out of the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. My backpack lay open, and every piece of food inside was green with mold. I'd packed freeze-dried meals, protein bars, and some jerky that should have lasted months. Now, it looked as if it had been rotting for weeks. Even the packaging had an unpleasant, sticky film on it. My water bladder was intact, but the rest was ruined. Worse, Jasper was nowhere in sight again. My sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside and tossed into the far corner of the tent, as though someone had pulled me out and carefully placed me back. But I hadn't heard or felt anything. My body shuddered in waves of anxiety. I emerged to look for Jasper, calling his name. My own voice sounded muffled, like I was shouting underwater. 10 minutes later, he reappeared from behind the pines, tail wagging but eyes uneasy. He had something in his mouth, a stiff, rotten scrap of fabric that looked ancient, maybe part of a dress sleeve. I told him to drop it, but he just stared. With my food ruined, I needed to reevaluate. I could try to push on to the next point on my route, closer to the forest's far edge, or I could turn back. But I wanted to salvage the trip. I told myself maybe I'd find a ranger or other hikers who could spare me some supplies or at least get me out safely. I felt irrationally determined not to flee. I didn't want to go home empty-handed, or so soon. More than that, I felt a strange compulsion to see this all through. It was like there was a magnet drawing me deeper into the forest. So, I broke camp. My compass spun oddly, as though magnetized by something. The needle jittered. Whatever was messing with my watch was also messing with the compass. That left me with a paper map. The map, ironically, seemed correct at first glance. I followed a trail that matched it for about half an hour. Then the path forked, though no fork was indicated. I took the left branch, thinking it was my best guess. But after nearly an hour of hiking, I passed a distinctive jagged rock I recognized from earlier that morning, even though I'd supposedly gone in the opposite direction. My footprints in the mud, accompanied by Jasper's paw prints, confirmed it was the same place. We'd somehow looped around. I turned to face Jasper. He was panting, restless. I tried another route, only to find more confusion. The forest's layout seemed to shift. Pines repeated. The undergrowth parted in odd patterns. It felt like we were stuck in a labyrinth. Finally, I was forced to accept that I was lost. So lost, in fact, I couldn't even find the original campsite from the previous night. My heart hammered with growing dread. Then, Out of nowhere, I heard footsteps. Fast, crunching footsteps, as if someone was running. My adrenaline spiked, but when the figure came into view, I recognized her instantly. My sister, Kate Miller. She wore her old forest ranger jacket, olive green with a worn emblem on the shoulder. I froze, astounded and oddly relieved. Then confusion set in. Kate and I hadn't spoken in weeks. My last conversation with her was an awkward phone call where I told her about this trip, but we never actually agreed to meet. Kate saw me, skidded to a stop, and burst into shaky laughter. "Hannah? Jesus, there you are." She came forward, pulling me into an abrupt hug. "I've been searching for you all morning. Are you okay?" She explained that she'd gotten a call from me the night before, late, close to midnight. I'd apparently been sobbing, telling her I was lost and needed help. I had no recollection of any such call. My phone was dead, but Kate insisted that she'd answered. "You sounded terrified, kept talking about some weird things in the trees." Though it made no logical sense, I felt a swelling in my chest as I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Kate was the logical one, the ranger with real wilderness experience. If anyone could get me out safely, it was her. We tried to use her satellite GPS, but the screen only displayed static. She cursed under her breath. Never seen this fail before. Even her watch froze on 6:45. Our combined frustration welled up, but Kate forced herself to remain calm. I could see her mind working through the situation. "It's got to be some electromagnetic interference," she said. "Could be geological, maybe sunspots." She sounded about half convinced. We stuck together, trying to retrace Kate's steps back to her car. But the deeper we hiked, the less sense everything made. It was as though the forest refused to allow escape. The day wore on, but the sky barely changed color, remaining a dull, grayish white. Eventually, we reached a clearing ringed by enormous pines. The clearing had a charred circle in the center, suggesting an old fire pit. I recognized it. It looked eerily similar to a clearing I'd passed hours ago, but there was no sign of my footprints. Kate groaned. "This is insane. It's like we're going in circles." By evening, we realized we'd have to make camp again. I hated the idea, but it was better than wandering aimlessly in the dark. We built a small fire. Kate insisted on it, for warmth and to ward off any potential predators. She had a stash of energy bars, which we shared. At least I had water from a nearby stream. It was crisp and tasted pure, so we used a portable filter just in case. We tried our phones again, but both were dead. No calls, no texts. The night came. The fire flickered, casting tall, dancing shadows on the surrounding pines. Jasper lay close to me, occasionally raising his head to stare into the darkness. The hairs on the back of my neck refused to settle. Kate kept glancing around with the same tension. She said she felt like someone was watching us. At one point, we heard a faint giggle, like a woman's soft laughter drifting on the wind. But there was no wind. I tried to talk to Kate about random childhood memories. Our family's annual Thanksgiving dinner, the time we got lost in the mall. She seemed to recall them, but sometimes she'd pause mid-sentence, as if forgetting crucial details. Then she'd refocus and continue. I chalked it up to stress. When I lay down to sleep, it was with the strong conviction that something was out there, something beyond normal explanation. I kept the tent flap slightly open, the flashlight in my hand. Hours might have passed. At some point, I drifted off. Then I was jarred awake by the loud snap of branches. Kate was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty. I scanned the area with my flashlight. She was nowhere in camp. "Kate?" I called. No answer. Jasper barked. I scrambled outside. Dim coals glowed in the fire pit. The night felt colder, almost raw. Then I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of my light's beam. Kate, or at least someone with her silhouette carrying what looked like an armful of firewood. "Kate," I said again, relief flooding through me. She walked slowly into view, but something was off. She didn't look at me right away, and when she did, her eyes were distant. Normally, she would have said, "I'm right here," or "Hey, you're up." But she was completely silent, fixating on me with an unblinking stare, mouth curved in a faint, unsettling smile. Her expression was flat, eerie, like she was wearing a mask. "You disappeared," I said. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She dumped the wood by the smoldering fire and turned to face me again. That smile never wavered. "Kate?" She cocked her head, like she was remembering how to speak. Finally, she whispered, "All is well." Her voice was off, layered with something else, like a faint echo. I blinked, feeling goosebumps rise on my arms. Jasper let out a sharp bark, backing away. Even he recognized something was wrong. I approached her, shining my flashlight in her face. She didn't flinch or shield her eyes. Her pupils looked dilated, reflecting the light in a weird, glassy sheen. "All is well," she repeated, in that same whispered tone. A chill shot through my spine. "Kate, snap out of it!" She blinked, slowly, once. "Why do you keep calling me that?" she murmured, and let out a little laugh. In that instant, I realized with terrifying clarity that she might not be my sister anymore, or something was controlling her. My throat dried up, my mind spinning. I stepped back. "Stop it, you're scaring me." Still that smile. Still those unblinking eyes. "You belong here," she said. "You always did." I felt a wave of nausea. How could this be the sister I grew up with? Then she jerked her head to one side as if listening to a voice in the trees. I risked a glance behind me, half expecting to see the pale woman from the night before. There was nothing but darkness. She advanced on me a step, and I raised my flashlight as a feeble barrier. Jasper growled, baring his teeth. Kate hissed, an actual hiss, like a snake. The sound made me recoil. "Kate?" I stammered, voice cracking. She blinked, and for a fraction of a second her eyes seemed more normal, as if she was fighting whatever had her. "Hannah?" She gasped, almost desperately. "Hannah? Run!" Then her face clenched in pain. She let out a grunt, doubling over. When she straightened, that eerie smile was back. I scrambled backward until I stood on the opposite side of the dying fire. I wanted to do something, help her, knock her out, anything. But I was paralyzed by fear. Then, as if losing interest, she turned her back to me and walked away from the camp into the trees, posture stiff, head cocked at an odd angle. I didn't follow. Part of me felt guilty for that, but fear overrode everything else. If she'd told me to run, then that meant she was aware of her situation, at least for a moment. So maybe the best thing was to stay put. I kept the fire alive as best I could. The rest of the night was a haze of terror. Every so often, I'd hear footfalls or faint laughter, but never saw Kate again until morning. At first light, I found her slumped near a fallen log about 30 yards from camp, eyes closed. Her face looked pale, and she was shivering. Cautiously, I approached, calling her name. She stirred, blinking in confusion. "What? What happened?" she asked. She didn't remember leaving. She didn't remember anything after laying down to sleep. I tried to explain, but she looked at me like I was telling her a dream. I guided her back to the camp. She was trembling, so I gave her my jacket. A small part of me suspected this was all a cruel trick, but the exhaustion on her face seemed genuine. We decided we needed to get out of that forest immediately, no matter what. But as we gathered our gear, we discovered more unsettling details. Kate's backpack was gone, completely vanished. My camera was nowhere to be found. And worst of all, an entire day's worth of footprints in and around the clearing had been wiped clean, as if the ground had been raked over. And so began our final attempt to escape. We set off, trying to maintain a steady direction by the position of the sun. The sky was hazy, so it was difficult, but it beat walking in circles. Every so often I'd test my phone or her GPS, still no sign of life. Our water was dwindling, and we had almost no food left. The air grew colder, a biting chill that felt unseasonal. Around what I guessed was midday, we made an unsettling discovery. We spotted a shape lying near the base of a thick pine tree. As we got closer, I realized it was a backpack. And not just any backpack, it was mine. That alone would have been bizarre enough, but it looked decades old. Weathered, mildewed, the fabric stiff and torn. My initials, HB, were still visible in faint black marker. Inside, I found items that I recognized. An extra pair of socks, a water bottle, but they too looked rotted and ancient. I felt tears prick my eyes. How was this possible? I'd been carrying my own pack just hours ago. I rubbed my eyes, looked again. The pack in front of me was definitely a ruin. Kate tried to speak calmly. "It must be someone else's with the same initials," she said. But her voice quavered. She didn't believe her own words. That's when we found the journal. It was my own. A small leather-bound notebook I'd planned to fill with trip notes. I'd only written one entry in it so far, the night before the trip, about how excited I was. But flipping through the rotted pages, I saw hundreds of entries in my handwriting, covering days and weeks. Some were almost illegible with water damage, but I could make out references to sleeping bag incidents, rotting supplies, repeated sightings of a woman in the trees. Some entries ended mid-sentence, trailing off into smeared ink. My mind reeled as I tried to imagine how or why I would write all that. The final entry had the date October 30th, 2023, days from now, and it read, "If you find this, iron is the only thing that hurts her. Use it on the totems. Burn the totems and keep iron close. She wants me for herself. She wants me to replace her." My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the notebook. Kate read over my shoulder, her face growing pale. "This is insane," she whispered. Then she glanced at me, terror shining in her eyes. "We need to keep moving, right now." We started forward again. The forest thickened, pines looming overhead. The path was non-existent. We were just climbing over roots and rocks. The hours dragged on, or maybe the minutes. Time felt meaningless. At one point, Jasper barked at something behind us and we spun around. Standing there, half obscured by the shadows, was the same pale woman I'd seen before, wearing what looked like a tattered dress from another century. Her eyes were sunken, face gaunt. She stared at me with a peculiar longing. Then she lifted a bony arm and pointed at Kate. Kate froze. I grabbed her by the wrist. "We should run," I hissed. But the woman spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through hollow bones. "Why do you steal from me?" I had no idea what she meant. I don't, I began, but Kate tugged on me and we bolted. Jasper let out a yelp, whether from fear or surprise, I wasn't sure. We ran until our lungs burned. When we finally slowed, the woman wasn't behind us. But the impression she'd burned into my mind lingered. Her eyes, they seemed older than the earth itself. Night came again, or something approximating night. We found ourselves in another clearing with a small ring of stones that might have once been a fire pit. Hopelessness weighed me down. I wanted to cry, but tears felt pointless. Kate slumped onto a fallen log, resting her head in her hands. "Hannah, do you remember Edith May?" I frowned, rummaging through my memory. The name tickled the edge of my mind. Edith May, something about a local legend. Was she that old ghost story Dad used to scare us with? Kate nodded. He said she went missing in 1864 after running away from an abusive husband. They say she wandered in these woods, half mad, searching for a place to die. Her spirit supposedly roams, luring others off the trail. Her eyes met mine. "You think that's the woman we're seeing?" My rational mind wanted to dismiss it, but everything was so beyond logic. "I don't know," I whispered, "but that might explain something." I swallowed hard. All these weird time glitches, rotting food, the journal with future dates. It's like we're stuck in her domain. Kate rubbed her arms. "We need to get out of here before we end up like her." Hunger and thirst tormented us, but neither of us had the energy to attempt hunting or foraging for unknown berries. Jasper stood by me, occasionally whining. I gave him the last of our water. We had no choice but to try to sleep. I dreamed of a woman's voice calling my name, telling me to follow. In the dream, I was a child again, lost in a fog. I woke in a cold sweat to total darkness. My flashlight flickered but wouldn't stay lit. I crawled out of the tent. The fire was dead. Kate was gone again. A nauseating wave of déjà vu swept over me. Heart pounding, I scanned the area. Jasper's ears were flat against his skull, tail tucked. He let out a high-pitched whimper. I followed the direction of his gaze. Kate stood at the edge of the clearing, back turned to me, head tilted skyward, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Her posture was all wrong. Knees slightly bent, arms slack at her sides. I approached slowly, hearing the crunch of leaves underfoot. "Kate," I whispered, "please come back." She whirled to face me. Her eyes glowed with the reflected moonlight. A twisted grin distorted her features. "Hannah," she purred, voice layered with something else. "Come see." She beckoned me. Despite every instinct screaming no, I took a step forward. She moved aside, revealing the dark silhouette of a pine tree. At first, it looked normal. Then my flashlight flickered just enough to illuminate a figure entangled in the trunk's roots. It was a body, desiccated, wearing a torn dress. The face was sunken, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. My breath caught, and I felt a wave of nauseous horror. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Kate's expression flickered. She half collapsed against the trunk, breathing heavily. Then, in a frantic whisper, she said, "You have to kill her. Burn the totems. Use iron." She coughed, eyes rolling. "Kate!" I lunged to grab her, but something in the dark yanked her backward. She let out a shriek, then collapsed onto the ground, writhing in agony. Her body convulsed, as if fighting an internal battle. Jasper barked frantically. I was too afraid to move closer, but I forced myself. I grabbed at Kate's arms. Her skin was cold to the touch. Then she went limp, eyes fluttering shut. Terror spiked my adrenaline. I dragged her back to the tent, feeling her faint heartbeat. She was alive, but unresponsive. For a moment, I thought she was lost for good. I cradled her head, tears finally breaking free. "Don't leave me," I whispered, "please." I stayed by her side, refusing to sleep. Eventually, her breathing steadied, but she didn't wake until morning. When she did, she was drained, half delirious. She barely recognized me. I forced her to sip some water from the stream, hoping it wasn't tainted. Then we resumed our trek, stumbling forward with no clear direction. Desperation gnawed at our minds. Hours blurred, or perhaps it was days. Time was meaningless. At one point, we discovered a half-buried ring of stones with wooden effigies shaped like pine cones and twisted human figures. We destroyed them, smashing them with rocks, remembering the clue from the journal. The wind howled. A voice hissed on the air. "You will never leave." Pine needles rained from above as though the forest itself raged at us. Then, unexpectedly, we found an even more disturbing scene. A circle of pine trunks, each carved with faces that looked suspiciously like mine and Kate's. Black, sap-like resin trickled from the carvings. In the center was a single iron stake, old and rusted, hammered into the ground. My chest clenched. This was no accident. I recalled the final entry in the rotted journal. "Iron is the only thing that hurts her. Use it on the totems." I wrested the stake from the ground. It was heavy, but I clung to it, feeling a spark of determination. "We can use this," I told Kate, who was barely conscious. She nodded weakly. Not long after, we heard a familiar barking. Jasper had run ahead and was barking as if cornering something. We hurried to catch up, forging through thick brush until we emerged into a small hollow encircled by towering pines. There, we finally saw her fully. The ghost, or creature, or whatever she was. A tall, gaunt woman with tattered clothing that might once have been an old-fashioned dress. Grayish skin clung to sharp bones. Her face was a nightmare. Eyes black pits, mouth full of broken teeth. She hovered near a twisted pine, her bony hand outstretched. At her feet lay the motionless body of another person. I froze, recognizing the jacket. It was Kate's ranger jacket. But Kate stood beside me. My mind reeled in utter confusion. The figure on the ground was Kate, pale and lifeless. My sister. I whipped around to confirm the Kate next to me was still there, but she was gone. I heard a sound behind me, footsteps. Turning, I saw her, the same tall, gaunt shape, but wearing Kate's face, though not convincingly. The eyes were vacant, the features twisted by a hideous grin. She was right behind me. I stumbled back, brandishing the iron stake. You replaced her," I whispered in horror. My voice cracked. The not Kate advanced, arms outstretched in a mockery of a hug. "I tried to tell you," she said softly, voice warping. "All is well." I swung the stake. It collided with her side and a bone-chilling shriek erupted. It was like metal scraping glass, full of rage and centuries of pain. She staggered back, dark fluid dripping from the wound. For a moment, her form flickered, revealing something else entirely. A figure of rotting bark and sinew. Pine needles embedded in flesh. Meanwhile, near the twisted pine, the ghostly figure of Edith May, if that's who it was, unleashed a shriek of her own. Her face contorted in fury as she clawed at the pine trunk. The trunk split, revealing a hollow interior crammed with bones and decaying remains. My stomach churned. The stench was overwhelming. Among the remains, I caught a glimpse of something that looked like Kate's backpack or a piece of it. Then the skeletal figure on the ground, wearing the ranger jacket, turned to dust. I realized in that moment that my real sister might already be dead, that the presence with me was just a hollow puppet. Hot tears blurred my vision. But still, I couldn't accept it. I raised the iron stake again. The not Kate lunged at me. I braced, shutting my eyes. Jasper leapt in, biting at her arm. She threw him aside with superhuman strength. He yelped, landing hard. I screamed in rage, driving the iron stake into her chest. The shriek that followed threatened to burst my eardrums. Her body convulsed, limbs flailing. For a split second, I saw Kate's face again, lips forming the word, "sorry." Then the figure crumpled to the ground, turning into a pile of old leaves, pine needles, and ash. I collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. Jasper lay a few feet away, whimpering. I crawled to him, checking for injury. He was alive, but shaken. a nasty bruise forming on his side. Then, from the corner of my eye, I spotted the spirit or shape of Edith May, barely holding form. She was fading in and out like a flickering candle. The top of her head shimmered with a strange pattern, and she emitted a hollow moan. As if realizing she'd lost control, she moved to vanish among the pines. With trembling hands, I picked up the stake again. The rotted journal had said, "Burn the totems and keep iron close." I saw a cluster of small effigies near the trunk, made of twigs and cloth. In a final surge of fury and desperation, I destroyed them, kicking them into a pile, lighting a match from my leftover pack. The flame guttered, but I coaxed it alive with bits of kindling. Fire roared up, devouring the effigies. The wind swelled, swirling ashes around us. Edith May let out one last shriek, loud enough to make me press my hands to my ears. Then she vanished in a swirl of dead leaves. Everything went eerily silent. The cold air disappeared, replaced by a still hush. The pine trees around us seemed less oppressive, less suffocating. A watery sun filtered through the branches, as though morning had finally arrived. I fell to my knees, tears burning my eyes, mourning Kate. I called her name, softly at first, then louder. No response. Hours later, maybe minutes, I can't be sure, I found my way out of the trees and stumbled onto a rough service road. I flagged down a passing vehicle, a ranger's truck. I babbled some incoherent story about being lost, about my sister. They rushed me to a nearby hospital in North Adams. I kept passing in and out of consciousness. In the ambulance, they asked me if I'd eaten any strange plants or mushrooms. They said I might be hallucinating from dehydration or hypothermia. I didn't bother explaining. I'd sound insane. At the hospital, I was treated for severe exposure, minor lacerations, and possible shock. Jasper was taken by an animal rescue group for a quick evaluation. He'd sprained a leg, but would be fine. The nurses kept asking about my sister, and I had nothing to say. No body was found. No sign that Kate had ever been there. The phone records showed no outgoing call from my phone. The nightmares of that forest haunted my every sleep. When the police and rangers searched the area I'd indicated, they found nothing but normal woodland. No rotted backpack, no ring of carved pine trunks, no totems. They did, however, discover a single old photograph pinned to a hollow tree, brittle and yellowed with age. The rangers wouldn't let me see it at first, but eventually, one took pity on me. It was a black and white image of two women. They stood side by side, arms around each other's shoulders, both wearing old-fashioned dresses. The background looked like the same pine forest I'd been in. The women's faces were partially faded, but the resemblance was undeniable. Me and Kate. I felt sick to my stomach, and the ranger snatched it away, insisting it must be some twisted prank. I've told myself 100 times that Kate might still be out there, that maybe some twisted dimension has her. Part of me believes she died in those woods, devoured by Edith May's curse. Another part wonders if she's still wandering, possessed, or maybe living out some alternate timeline. The not knowing is the worst. Even after they released me from the hospital, I can't escape the feeling that something clings to me. I hear Jasper barking, sometimes in the dead of night, from inside my closet or beneath the bed, even when he's asleep at my feet. One evening, as I brushed my hair, a pine needle fell out. I stared at it for a long time before throwing it away. I haven't touched my camera or tried to go hiking again. Every so often, I check my phone, half expecting to see old black and white photos or calls to Kate that I never made, but it stays normal. The only time it flickers is at exactly 6:45 a.m., and the battery icon dancing for a split second before returning to normal. Then, I hear the faintest whisper of laughter, like a memory of the wind. The nightmares continue. In them, I'm in the same clearing, standing before the twisted pine, and I see Kate's face in the bark. She weeps sap instead of tears, and her mouth moves silently, forming the word, sorry, over and over. Then Edith May appears behind me, a skeletal hand resting on my shoulder. I wake up drenched in sweat, heart hammering. I wish I could say I found peace, that I buried the hatchet, left the haunting behind. But every day something small reminds me that the forest isn't done with me. Maybe it never will be. People warn each other that the woods are dangerous if you stray off the marked trails. They worry about bears, twisted ankles, or getting lost. They don't realize the deeper darkness that lurks among those ancient pines waiting for the lonely, the wounded, the ones who think they can handle it all alone. If you're reading this, if you find any mention of Edith May, or sense that time itself is unraveling, turn back. Because once you enter her domain, she won't let you go without taking part of you with her. I keep telling myself that I escaped, but the nightmares suggest otherwise. And sometimes, in the early morning hours, I swear I hear Kate's voice, calling me back into the pines. My name is Henry Dalton, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in October of 2023, in the northern woods of Mount Greylock State Reservation, Massachusetts. If you ever find yourself there with a loyal German shepherd named Max by your side, I beg you to turn back before it's too late. I learned that caution far too late, and it almost destroyed me. I'm just a normal guy, a freelance graphic designer from Albany who once did well for himself in the city. No, I'm not a veteran or some survival expert. I'm just a bit stubborn and used to be a Boy Scout in my teen years. Old habits from those days gave me the arrogance to believe I could handle a few nights alone in the woods, especially with Max as my partner. And to be honest, I just wanted peace. After too many months of deadlines, demanding clients, and canceled vacations, I thought a long weekend out in nature would reset my mind. Instead, it took me to a place where time and reality stretched like rotting sinews, and a long-dead ranger welcomed me into his endless domain of ash. I drove to Mount Greylock State Reservation in my battered SUV, leaving Albany just before dawn on a crisp Friday in mid-October. The roads along the scenic byways were stunning, gold, red, and orange leaves swirling in gentle breezes. My phone's GPS was still chirping away happily with directions, but I'd already decided to turn it off when I got near the park. I had a physical map I'd printed out, and I wanted to rely on old-school navigation. The idea of getting lost in nature was the entire point. Little did I know I would get my wish, deeper than anyone would ever want. On the way, I stopped at a small general store near the base of the mountain. It was the kind of place you could blink and miss, tucked among tall pines with a faded sign reading Greylock Provisions. The elderly clerk stood behind the counter, wearing a patched flannel shirt and an expression that said he'd seen more than he let on. Max padded in at my side, tail wagging, as I purchased some extra trail mix, water bottles, and a small propane canister for my portable stove. "You heading up to the summit for the weekend?" the clerk asked, taking in my gear and Max's alert posture. "That's the plan," I replied. "I've got a campsite in mind near the Sperry Road trailhead. Then maybe we'll climb to the top Saturday." He nodded slowly. "Beautiful place, but keep your wits. Fires up there. Well, they don't always behave. Locals say you shouldn't go near the old watchtower after dark. Folks hear footsteps on nights with no wind, footsteps in the ash." I paid him, offered a polite smile, and left. The warning felt like an urban legend, the kind of spooky campfire tale you'd tell kids. I was amused by it at the time, and maybe even a little intrigued. The naive part of me thought I'd gotten exactly what I wanted. An interesting story to tell after I came back to civilization. The drive up the reservation road to the trailhead was scenic, though the trees grew unnervingly dense. By the time I parked, the day was well underway. Sunshine drenched the leaves, sending shifting shadows across the forest floor. Max leapt out, sniffing the gravel, his brown eyes alert. He was always a good companion, fiercely protective, but also the first to wag his tail at a stranger. I'd never known him to shy away from anything. That's what made it so unnerving when we crossed into the deeper pines, and he went completely silent. The first moment I sensed something off was less than a mile in. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Normally you'd hear squirrels rustling, the chatter of small birds, or the faint hum of insects. Instead, the only sound was my own breathing and the crunch of pine needles underfoot. Max's nose was glued to the ground. Then he'd lift his head to stare into the trees, ears pricked. Whenever I paused to rest, he would freeze and peer into the distance. I couldn't see or hear anything that concerned him, but it was clear something had him on edge. "Hey, boy," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "You pick up a strange scent?" He didn't bark, didn't whine, just held his tail rigid. Max was typically a chatterbox of a dog, barking at squirrels or whining for treats, so his profound silence sparked the first flicker of unease in me. We reached the designated campsite near Sperry Road Campground by mid-afternoon. Only a few other vehicles were in the parking area, and I didn't spot any other campers in the immediate vicinity. Perfect, I thought. Secluded, quiet, my own private little wilderness retreat. I set up my tent, a simple dome with enough room for me and Max, then began gathering firewood. The store clerk's words about the fire not behaving echoed in my mind, but I shrugged it off. Sure enough, though, when dusk rolled around and I tried to light a campfire, the kindling I'd collected felt oddly damp and brittle, even though the day had been sunny and crisp. It took me a frustrating half hour just to get a weak flame going. I stoked it patiently, adding small twigs to build it up. Eventually, I had a modest fire that cast dancing shadows through the campsite. I ate a quiet dinner, sharing some jerky with Max, who still watched the darkening forest with a vigilance I'd never seen. My phone buzzed once with a text from a client, just a reminder about Monday deadlines, so I turned the device off. I wanted no interruptions, ironically enough. I told myself the sense of unease was just residual city stress, but when full night settled over the woods, that creeping dread inside me deepened. The wind picked up from somewhere above, rustling branches. Embers from my fire drifted upward, and once or twice I could have sworn the embers formed shapes, like silhouettes of people dancing in the sparks. I dismissed it as imagination. I'm a creative mind. Illusions come easily to me. Telling ghost stories to yourself is part of the fun, right? Eventually, I unrolled my sleeping bag in the tent and lay down with Max curled at my side. I couldn't shake the sense that he was listening for something. He dozed lightly, eyes half open, ears twitched at the faintest sound. Sometime in the night, I drifted into a restless sleep. When I awoke in the morning, I discovered my sleeping bag was completely unzipped, and in such a way that suggested I'd climbed out. But I had no memory of leaving the tent. Worse, I found the zipper parted from inside. My heart hammered in my chest. I told myself maybe I'd just woken up to pee in the night and forgot, but a gnawing doubt told me that I was lying to myself. Max sat at the tent's opening, blinking at me. He didn't look alarmed, just watchful, though he never barked. I stepped out and realized the fire pit was cold. I'd expected embers from the logs I burned, but the remains looked ancient, like charcoal after a month of rain. Even the arrangement of stones had changed, as though someone had rearranged them in the dark. I tried to force calm. I made a quick breakfast on my small propane stove. As I unzipped my backpack to retrieve a water bottle, I found it coated in a thin film of dust. Dust that smelled like ash. I told myself it was just the forest's doing, maybe spores from mushrooms or remains from a burnt log. Still, I couldn't explain the rearranged fire pit or the absence of the usual embers. Anxiety flickered through my mind, but I tamped it down. I'd come out here to prove something to myself after all. I had one more night in this place before I hiked up to the summit. I reasoned that by the next evening I'd either be sleeping in the more populated area near the top, or I might even return to my car if the weirdness persisted. Later that morning, I decided to set off for a short hike along one of the trails that led toward the summit, to scout it out. It was a bright day, sun glimmering through the canopy. The breeze was fresh, the forest scenic in the golden light. Even with the strange events at camp, I felt my mood lift. The trail was well worn, but after half an hour, my phone's GPS started to act up, refusing to pinpoint my location, and my compass needle jiggled back and forth, never settling on north. I laughed it off. Maybe there was some local electromagnetic issue or my phone needed a software update. I shut it off again, leaning on the printed map. A mile in, however, the signage and my map didn't match. According to the map, the path should lead to a ridge overlooking the valley, but the wooden arrow said something else entirely, referencing a caution fire tower restricted. A quick double take told me the sign looked old, splintered, like it had withstood decades of harsh winters. Strange, because I'd read up on local trails and knew that any restricted area had long since been reopened. Still, I was curious, so I followed the arrow out of some misguided sense of exploration. Max walked close to me, head lowered, occasionally tensing as if he heard footsteps I couldn't. I found an overgrown footpath that seemed rarely used, the vegetation thick around the ankles. The further we went, the darker the forest became, as though the sun's rays were blocked by an unseen wall of branches. The smell of damp earth and rotted leaves got stronger, though the day was still fresh. By early afternoon, I felt a chill in the air. My breath started to mist, even though the temperature had been mild. Max and I reached a clearing. In the center, an old ranger outpost stood, half collapsed from what looked like fire damage. The roof was charred, the walls blistered. A sign out front read, "Ranger Mallory, Wildfire Watch." My skin prickled. It reminded me of that local legend about the old watchtower, about footsteps in the ash. I thought about the clerk's warning, about how a ranger died here decades ago. Slowly, I pushed open the warped wooden door. Inside, an acrid smell stung my nose. Burnt paper, decaying wood, and something else that made my eyes water. Against one wall was a small desk stacked with blackened papers. I gently brushed soot off some of the top sheets. Most had crumbled into dust. Near a half-burnt corner, I found a photograph. It showed a tall man with a ranger's hat, proudly smiling. The back had faded pen markings. Ranger W. Mallory, 1932. A group of hikers stood beside him, all wearing old-fashioned gear. My heart jolted when I noticed one hiker looked eerily like me. The same shape of face, nearly the same hair. The photo was in black and white, so I couldn't read eye color, but the resemblance was uncanny. The man even wore a jacket that could have been mine, save for the era. Then I realized the date, 1932. This was well before I was born, before my parents were even alive. I dropped the photograph like it was infected. Max let out a low whine, the first vocalization he'd made all day. I felt eyes on me, as if someone or something was watching from the corners. My mouth went dry. The interior was dim, only an open gash in the roof letting some sunlight through, creating a weird play of shadows on the scorched floor. I took a shaky breath, knelt to gather my composure. Then I heard the scuff of a boot behind me. Spinning around, I half expected to see a squatter or a homeless wanderer. Instead, there was nothing. Max's ears flattened, and he backed up, a deep rumble in his throat. The air got colder, my vision blurred. I swear the blackened walls undulated as if they were breathing. Then the whisper started, a raspy voice I couldn't quite pinpoint. Henry, Henry, Henry. I was alone in that outpost, but something whispered my name like it knew me intimately. I bolted for the door, Max at my side, panting in near panic. We scrambled out of that clearing, ignoring any sense of direction or reason. Branches tore at my clothes. I cut my cheek on a thorn bush, hardly noticing the sting. I just ran until the forest opened up and I saw a slender dirt road that I didn't recall seeing on any map. Panting, I tried to calm down, checking my phone for the time. The battery was down to 10%, which shouldn't have been possible since I'd turned it off and charged it the night before. The date read March 6th, 1932. I blinked, then tapped the screen. It flickered, glitched out, then died. Okay, that's not funny, I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh. I tried to rationalize it as an error in the phone's system clock, some glitch with the GPS messing with the date, but part of me felt real terror. That photo, with my near double from 1932, still hovered in my mind. It took hours to find the trail again, or at least a trail. Some of the landmarks I expected were missing or altered. After picking through the woods, I managed to stumble back to my campsite by late afternoon, completely physically and mentally exhausted. I felt as though I'd walked 100 miles. My watch said 4:30 p.m., but the sun seemed to be setting, which was too early. Or maybe I'd lost track of time. My sense of direction was shot. Max seemed relieved to be back in the small clearing where we'd pitched the tent. But the relief was short-lived. I found my sleeping bag tossed halfway across the site, half buried in dead leaves, as though someone dragged it out of the tent. My supplies, granola bars, freeze-dried meals, had rotted into a putrid mess of mold, even though they'd been fine just that morning. My water container was cracked, the liquid inside reeking of sulfur. I wanted to scream, to rage. This made no sense. What the hell was happening? The confusion, fear, and anger inside me twisted into a single knot in my gut. I started for my phone, remembered it was dead and cursed. I could have tried to use my rechargeable battery pack, but something told me it wouldn't work. Still, I rummaged through my gear. The battery pack was gone. Also missing was my paper map. Gone. I spun in place, looking around the campsite, hoping to see a sign of footprints or an animal's rummaging, anything that could rationalize this. The ground was scuffed in multiple places, as if many feet had passed through. Then, out of nowhere, Max barked. I've never been so startled by my own dog. His bark echoed across the trees, deep and urgent. He was fixated on a shape standing at the edge of the woods. A tall figure in what looked like a tattered ranger's uniform. My heart hammered. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping closer. "What are you doing here?" He didn't respond. He turned away, took a few steps, and vanished behind a tree. As I moved to follow, Max blocked my path with his body, teeth bared. It was as though he wanted to save me from the worst mistake of my life. Shaking and freezing, I realized the temperature was dropping unnaturally fast. The sun was nearly gone, or else hidden behind a bank of clouds that had rolled in. I had no idea how day had turned to twilight so quickly. My breath formed little clouds in front of my face. I tried to relight the campfire, but the wood I'd gathered earlier was soggy and crumbled like desiccated leaves. I had a small propane stove, so I set that up for warmth and light, which offered minimal comfort. Night closed in like a living thing. pressing in on my tiny circle of pale illumination. My stomach rumbled, still full of dread from seeing my supplies decimated. I managed to find a single unopened bag of jerky I'd stashed in a side pocket, so I ate a little and shared some with Max. He licked my hand, ears drooped. I think he sensed my terror. I'm sure he felt it too. Then a single bark from Max shattered the silence. His entire body went rigid. He took off into the darkness with a growl before I could stop him. I grabbed my flashlight and followed, my steps stumbling in the uneven forest floor. Shouts died in my throat, replaced by frantic panting. The light flickered, revealing glimpses of branches that seemed to claw at me, but never giving me a full view. It felt like I ran for ages. Eventually, I heard Max whimpering. I found him cowering under a partially burned tree that was black from trunk to limb, as though lightning or fire had consumed it. The ground around it had a carpet of gray ash, dotted with footprints. Bare, human footprints with elongated toes. Worst of all, the ash was warm to the touch, though the surrounding air was near freezing. I petted Max, felt him trembling. That's when I noticed something near his paw. A warped metal badge, half fused into a layer of charred flesh. I couldn't identify the shape, but it resembled a ranger's shield. I lifted my gaze and saw them. Footprints leading away from this blackened tree deeper into the forest. But they ended abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished. I stood there in disbelief, the stink of burnt wood almost overpowering. I realized how far I'd run from camp. Fog had started rolling in, muffling the environment. We needed to go back to the tent, to safety, though I didn't know if I'd ever be safe in these woods again. I began walking, calling for Max to follow. A strange, tingling sensation crept along my arms and legs, as though invisible spiders crawled over my skin. The forest started to twist. Each cluster of trees looked suspiciously similar, and I spotted an arrangement of stones that I swore I'd passed by minutes before. Twice, I tripped over the same root, recognized it by the shape of moss clinging to it. Time was warping, or so it felt. My watch was no help. It had simply stopped. The second hand quivered between ticks, refusing to advance. After hours, at least it felt like hours, I finally found the glowing gloom of my lantern. I stumbled into my campsite, breath ragged. Max slumped to the ground, tail between his legs. I don't remember if I even slept that second night. I might have dozed off, half sitting, clutching the flashlight as though it was the only thing anchoring me. At some point, I think I dreamt of the scorched ranger outpost, of footsteps swirling in ash. But maybe it wasn't a dream at all. Come morning, I think it was morning, but the sky remained leaden and gray, I discovered something else. My entire campsite looked older, like it had been abandoned for months. The tent's material was weathered and torn at the seams, covered in a thin blanket of black soot. My sleeping bag was missing entirely, as though it had wandered off on its own. And strangest of all, Max was gone. I spun in place, calling his name over and over. My voice reverberated through empty woods. No bark answered. Waves of panic shot through me. I thought maybe he'd gone searching for breakfast or chasing a squirrel, but the deeper dread told me something else had taken him. Maybe that ranger figure, or worse. I gathered what gear I could salvage, mostly useless now, and set out to search for my dog. I tried to head for the car, thinking maybe he'd gone that way, but the path I took didn't lead me to the trailhead. Instead, it looped around until I ended up back at the same clearing where the blackened tree stood. That's when I heard barking again, or at least I thought I did. It was faint, carried on the wind, as if from miles away. I moved toward it like a man possessed, ignoring the creeping sense of being watched. The bark led me to a rocky area near the mountain's slope. Hidden behind a tangle of vines and fallen logs, I found a rusted metal grate. partially covering what looked like an old mine entrance. The barking was definitely coming from inside, echoing in the darkness. I shoved the grate aside with some effort, the corroded metal scraping across stone. The smell that seeped out was foul, a mixture of damp rot and something acrid, chemical. I flicked on my flashlight. The tunnel yawned before me, jagged rock walls lit by a flickering beam. My phone, of course, was useless and dead, so this flashlight was my only source of illumination. I called out to Max, hearing my voice bounce back. He barked again, sounding anxious but alive. I made my way deeper, carefully, mind reeling with 1,000 possibilities. If Max had run in here or been dragged, no, I forced that thought aside. I had to get him back. The ground was muddy, water trickling from cracks. My footsteps echoed ominously. After about 50 yards, I found what looked like an abandoned campsite, or perhaps a stash. A battered backpack, half-eaten rations that had turned to dust, a few rusted cans. A battered lantern was lying on its side. Then the beam of my flashlight caught movement. A person, or what looked like one. He scrambled back, eyes wild. He looked to be in his 30s, but with streaks of gray in his hair. His face was caked in dirt, fingernails cracked and black. He wore tattered hiking clothes that might have been from the 1980s. Neon jacket, acid-washed jeans. He smelled like old sweat and fear. "Please," he whispered, "don't come any closer." I froze. "Who are you?" "Jonas," he croaked, coughing. "I got lost here. Oh God, it's been so long. I got here in 1984. My mind refused to process his words. That was nearly 40 years ago, but he looked no older than me at most. You can't have been here since 1984, I said, voice wavering. That's impossible. He shook his head, tears cutting a path through the grime on his cheeks. I've tried to leave. Every path leads back. Time doesn't work here anymore. Before I could question him further, Max whined from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. My relief soared when I realized he was still alive. But Jonas grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You can't go deeper," he said, voice trembling. "He'll take you too." I pushed past him, ignoring his pleas, compelled by the bond with my dog. The tunnel branched into a narrower passage, and soon I found Max lying there, panting heavily, tangled in some old coils of rope. He was unharmed, just trapped. I began working to free him, my hands shaking with adrenaline. But as soon as I tugged the last coil away, Max let out a guttural snarl and snapped at my arm, something he'd never done. I jumped back, stunned, and for a moment his eyes looked almost human, brimming with rage. Then he shook his head as if confused, whining apologetically. I coaxed him, gently placed a hand on his neck, and he licked me. My relief lasted only seconds before I heard Jonas scream from the main cavern. Clutching the flashlight, I led Max out to see what happened. Jonas was sprawled on the ground, face contorted in agony. A charred figure stood over him, smoke rising from its uniform, the brim of its ranger hat fused with molten flesh at the temples. Its eyes were black hollows, leaking ash. Jonas locked eyes with me in terror, mouth open, but no sound came out. The figure bent in an impossible angle and breathed a swirl of ash onto Jonas's face. I watched in horror as Jonas's skin aged decades in seconds. Wrinkles forming, hair whitening, body deflating. He died there, rotting to near mummification before my eyes. The charred figure turned its black gaze on me, lips peeling back to reveal jagged teeth. I stumbled back, brandishing my flashlight as if it were a sword. A wave of dizziness struck me. The figure advanced a step, then disappeared in a swirl of ash. That's when I noticed Jonas's body was gone, replaced by a rotten skeleton in tattered clothing. His wide-open eyes had melted into dust. I gagged, the smell of putrefaction overwhelming. Unable to bear it, I clutched Max's scruff and fled the tunnel, passing the backpack and old supplies that must have belonged to Jonas decades ago. My mind spun with the realization that time really was broken in these woods. Jonas had been from 1984, but looked no older than me, until the figure took him, and that figure wore a melted ranger's hat. That had to be Mallory. Outside the mine, it was somehow midday. The sun was shining, the fog gone, as if no time had passed. But I felt changed. Everything around me looked slightly off, like the colors were too dull. The pines loomed overhead, ancient judges. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Max limped now, as though drained by the encounter. Yet, as soon as we exited that place, he walked straight to me and whimpered. There was still recognition in his eyes, which gave me hope that he wasn't fully lost, but that savage growl he'd shown me remained in the back of my mind. Something had touched him in that tunnel. "He'll take you too," Jonas had said, and he had, I was sure of it. Nevertheless, I had to try to leave. I was done. I didn't want to spend another minute in these cursed woods. I had no idea how to get back to the campsite or the car, but I hoped following the slope downward would eventually lead me to a road or a ranger station. My sense of direction was battered, but maybe I'd get lucky. We walked for what felt like half a day, my stomach growling. I'd lost most of my supplies, leaving me with only a couple of protein bars. My water was nearly gone. The thought of scavenging or foraging for food in these twisted woods made me nauseous. Trees around us had this persistent char smell, even though many looked healthy. Every so often I heard crunching footsteps behind me, only to find no one there when I turned around. Once, I looked to my right and spotted my own reflection in a puddle. I looked older, lines etched into my face, stubble that was almost gray. I blinked and touched my chin. My fingers brushed short, dark stubble that I normally kept shaved. I shouldn't have had that much facial hair in just a couple of days. At last, we found a trail sign. It was rotted, leaning precariously, nearly illegible. But I recognized the name Sperry Road Trailhead. Relief flared in me, albeit short-lived, as I realized the arrow pointed in a direction that made no sense based on where I believed we'd come from. Still, I had no better guide, so I followed it. Max trailing behind, occasionally giving low growls at shadows. Hours later, the forest opened up to reveal my campsite again. Except, it looked even more decayed. The tent was crushed under a fallen branch. My spare clothes had rotted away or been scattered. But my car wasn't there, obviously, because I'd parked miles away. I sank to my knees in frustration and wept. This was impossible. I stared around at the ring of trees, noticing the black footprints in the ash that ringed the site. Bare footprints. They circled in a wide arc, some large, some small, all black with soot. Clearly, multiple entities had walked around. A rustle made me look up. Max was rummaging around the brush. I realized with a start that he was searching for my missing supplies. Or maybe he smelled food. I forced myself to stand and gather any salvageable items. There wasn't much. The entire place reeked of neglect. My watch read 2:15 p.m., but the sky was darkening again, the sun already behind the peak. The sense of time fracturing returned, like a bad dream you can't wake from. When night fell, for what seemed like the second or third time that day, I decided to try once more to build a fire. I found enough dry tinder from the dead brush. To my surprise, the flame took easily this time, flaring high. But the flames themselves had an odd bluish tinge around the edges, and the smoke smelled of acid. My eyes watered, forcing me to step back. Even so, I relished the warmth, refusing to let fear kill my chance for survival. Huddled by that unnatural fire, I felt something shift. I looked at Max, and he was staring at me, unblinking. The longer I looked back, the more I realized something was off. His eyes reflected the flames in a peculiar way. He seemed to be smiling. It was uncanny. Then, in a grotesque moment, he opened his mouth and, in a voice eerily close to my own, said, "Henry!" I screamed, stumbling back. That single word, or approximation of it, was distorted, layered with a raspy undertone. Max's expression immediately shifted to confusion, ears flattening. He let out a strangled whine, as if something inside him had forced that speech. I tasted blood in my mouth. I'd bitten my tongue in panic. Shaking, I grabbed the one weapon I had, a small flare gun from my emergency kit. I still had a single bright red flare loaded. Stay back," I managed, tears burning my eyes. Max crouched, tail between his legs, looking both terrified and possessed. For a moment, I saw Mallory's face superimposed over the dog's muzzle. Charred flesh, hollow eyes, black soot dripping from empty sockets. Then it was gone, and Max whined again, trembling. I realized I was pointing a flare gun at my own companion, the dog who'd saved me from countless nightmares with his companionship alone. My heart fractured. I let my arm fall to my side, tears stinging my cheeks. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, boy." Without warning, Max lunged. I braced for the worst. His teeth clamped onto my arm, tearing through the fabric of my jacket, drawing blood. I howled in pain, fumbling. I squeezed the trigger reflexively. The flare launched with a loud pop, hitting Max's flank in a burst of red phosphorus. He yelped and released me, bounding away into the darkness as embers trailed off him. My entire body shook. I couldn't believe I'd shot my dog. But that thing inside him wasn't my dog. Or it wasn't just my dog. I cradled my wounded arm, biting back screams. Blood poured between my fingers. The darkness around me flickered with shadows as the last of the flare's glow receded. Then I realized how quiet it had become. No wind, no insects, no rustling in the trees. Just the crackle of the bluish flames. My eyes drifted to the edge of that circle of light, half expecting the charred ranger to appear. That's when I spotted him, standing maybe 20 yards away, at the threshold of the flickering glow. Ranger Mallory. He was taller than I expected, though his spine looked twisted, as if half melted. His face was locked in a permanent grimace of pain and rage. Soot and smoke curled around him in shapes that almost resembled skeletal arms. "Stay away!" I shouted. "Stay the hell away from me!" He lifted a blackened hand, pointing at me. My ears filled with a roaring sound, as though 1,000 voices were chanting my name backward. My body vibrated, the hair on my arms rising. The next thing I knew, the fire died abruptly, plunging the area into near total darkness. Only the faint glow of embers remained, and in that flickering half-light, Mallory advanced. I stumbled backward, adrenaline flaring. I remembered Jonas's words. "He'll take you too." I wasn't ready to die, not like this, not in this place. With a sudden surge of desperate courage, I grabbed the can of bear spray from my belt, aimed, and unleashed it. The chemicals shot out in an orange mist. For a split second, Mallory seemed to shrink away, his form dissolving at the edges. He screeched in a soundless gape, and the ash swirling around him scattered. I took the opportunity to sprint away, ignoring the pain in my arm as blood seeped through my torn sleeve. I ran blindly into the night, stumbling over rocks, nearly cracking my head on tree trunks. My breathing was ragged, heart hammering. The forest around me twisted in on itself. Every time I thought I'd found a path, it bent back to the same clearing or a similar one. Branches lashed at me like living whips. Several times I fell. My boots got soaked in some boggy patch that hadn't been there before. Each time I blinked, the moon's position in the sky seemed to shift drastically. Finally, near total collapse, I noticed a flickering light through the trees. My heart leapt at the idea it might be a road or a ranger station. Instead, I came upon a battered, rust-eaten sign. Wildfire, watchtower, restricted access. Past it stood a tall metal structure that had partially collapsed, the scaffolding blackened by old flames. It rose above the tree line, leaning precariously. I realized with growing horror this was the place the clerk had warned me about. The place where Mallory had presumably died in that 1932 fire. With no other sense of direction, I climbed the tower's old staircase, hoping to see some vantage point, some sign of the highway. The steps groaned under my weight, and once or twice I nearly put my foot through a rotten board. But I persisted, climbing higher and higher until I reached a small observation platform near the top. From there, I saw a breathtaking view. The valley below, lights glimmering in the distance. The lights of a city. Relief crashed over me. My mind seized on the notion that I could see the real world from here. Maybe I could orient myself and find a route out at first light. But behind me, footsteps. Slow, measured, coming up the stairs. I tried to ready the bear spray, but my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped it. A figure stepped onto the platform. By the faint starlight, I saw the molten hat, the charred uniform, the half-skeletal grin. My mind screeched. I fired the bear spray again, but this time the can only sputtered. Mallory advanced, jaw unhinging, a wet crackling sound in his throat. I swung wildly, connecting with nothing but air. A wave of black soot slammed into me, forcing me back. I nearly toppled over the edge. Scrambling, I felt a small metal container behind me. An emergency box, presumably for flares or other supplies. In a frenzy, I wrenched it open, found a single flare canister. I still had the empty gun from earlier. My hand fumbled to load it. Mallory loomed closer, eyes dripping black tar, arms extended. He whispered my name, a hiss of ash and heat. In the gloom, I caught a fleeting glimpse of Max on the steps behind him, eyes glowing with that same eerie pallor. Somehow, with trembling fingers, I loaded the new flare. The second Mallory lunged, I fired. The flare struck him in the chest, igniting a burst of crimson fire. His scream was soundless but reverberated in my skull. Ash exploded outward in a whirlwind, forcing me to shield my face. The tower shook violently, and I felt the structure give way. The supports must have corroded beyond measure. Metal snapped, and I hurled myself downward, tumbling painfully down flight after flight of stairs, bruising ribs, cutting open my forehead. I landed at the base with a jarring thud that knocked the wind out of me. When the dust settled, the top half of the tower had collapsed, a twisted wreck of metal. No sign of Mallory. The char and ash swirling in the air dissipated into the night breeze. With throbbing limbs and a potentially broken rib, I crawled to my feet, eyes flicking around. Max was nowhere to be seen. So was Mallory. Had I destroyed him? The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I doubted it was that easy. My mind screamed for me to flee, and so I did. I limped into the forest, guided by the faint city lights I'd spotted from above. I trudged, ignoring the protests of my injured body, forcing myself to walk. Each step was agony. The night seemed endless. Occasionally, I glimpsed headlights flickering far below the tree line. Around what felt like dawn, I finally found a road. I recognized it, the main scenic road near Mount Greylock State Reservation, the same one that led me in. But here, no cars passed. It was deserted. I stumbled along the pavement until I saw my SUV parked near the sign for Sperry Road Trailhead. Relief and confusion warred in me. I was sure I'd hiked miles away from the car, But there it was, unscratched, exactly as I'd left it. I fumbled with my keys, wrenched the door open, and half collapsed into the driver's seat. My phone was on the dash, dead battery. The clock on the dash read 6:13 a.m., but the date was absent. As soon as I turned the ignition, the radio blared static. The engine coughed, but eventually roared to life. I pulled onto the road, letting out a breath I'd been holding for what seemed like days. I drove down the mountain, grateful for the comforting feel of asphalt under my tires. When I reached a rest area near the base, I pulled in. The sun was now rising properly, casting golden light across the pines. Trembling, I tried my phone again. This time, it turned on, but the screen displayed a date that made no sense. March 1932. I reset it manually and tried to gather a signal. Miraculously, I got a single bar of reception. The new date read October 2023, but the time was 3 days later than when I first arrived. By my reckoning, I'd only been on the mountain for 2 nights. I drove home to Albany in a daze, stopping only for gas and bandages to wrap my arm. The clerk at the gas station looked me over like I was some kind of lunatic, but said nothing. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed fresh scars on my cheek, gray threads in my hair that hadn't been there before. I looked older, weaker, eyes bloodshot and haunted. When I reached my small apartment, I found my mailbox full of overdue notices and packages that dated nearly a week prior. My phone started pinging with messages from clients, friends, and even my landlord, all asking where I'd been. I told them I was only going for the weekend. Their messages suggested I'd been missing for a week or more. In a dazed panic, I rushed inside and called for Max, hoping, illogically, that he'd somehow be there waiting. But the apartment was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Nobody believed my story when I tried to explain. The local park rangers, after hearing my frantic call, insisted they found nothing unusual at the campsite. No collapsed tower. No sign of a meltdown or a horrifying figure in the woods. They did mention there was once a forest fire back in 1932, which took the life of a ranger named William Mallory, but no one else reported anything out of the ordinary. They also found no trace of my dog. Days later, I sat in my living room, nursing a cup of coffee laced with whiskey, flipping through local historical archives I'd found online. I discovered a photo from 1932. Ranger Mallory, standing with a group of hikers. My face stared back at me from among them, blurred but unmistakable. An eerie sense of déjà vu made me want to smash my computer screen. Somehow, I had existed in that time. Or something wearing my face had. Every night since, I've dreamed of ash footprints tracking through my apartment, leading to my bedroom. Sometimes, I hear scratching at the front door. I open it to find Max, eyes gleaming, muzzle parted in a grin that stretches too wide. Other times, I see Jonas's corpse, or a twisted version of my own face in charred uniform. The shadows flicker with an impossible flame, and I wake drenched in sweat. Yesterday, a new horror greeted me. My watch has been running backwards, the second hand sweeping in reverse. The battery I replaced just last week died in hours. My reflection in the bathroom mirror appears older each morning. Friends ask if I'm sleeping, if I need help. I can't begin to explain what happened, or what's still happening. I keep hearing an odd shuffling sound in the hallway late at night, as if clawed feet are pacing outside. Sometimes I open the door, half expecting Max to be there, but there's only silence. In those moments, I can almost smell the faint scent of burnt wood and rotting leaves. I hope this account will serve as a warning. If you go to Mount Greylock, beware the old trails, the restricted watchtower, anything to do with the 1932 wildfire. If you see footprints in ash, or hear the name Mallory whispered on the wind, run. Time doesn't flow the way it should in that place, and even if you think you leave, part of it never leaves you. I still feel a piece of me, a piece of my soul, trapped in those blackened woods. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear a single bark, deep, resonant, and distant. Max, or what's left of him. If you ever hear a dog's bark echo through a silent, ancient forest, take heed. You might think it's just a lost animal calling for help, but after what I've seen, I fear it might be something else entirely, wearing a shape you want so desperately to trust. I shot my best friend. I saw a man die in front of me, his life drained by something that shouldn't exist. I set a ghost ablaze, only to have him linger in my nightmares. And the worst part is, I'm not sure I ever really came back. I look at the clock on my wall now, and I see the hour hand ticking forward, but the minute hand edging backward. My phone updates the date to random years, 1932, 1984, 2023. I can't tell which is real. Each day I notice small signs of rot in my apartment, black flecks that smell of charcoal. I dust them away, but they return, forming footprints in the corner of the living room. Then they vanish as soon as I blink. Maybe one day, the parted dimension that grips me will snap shut, and I'll vanish completely. Or maybe Ranger Mallory is biding his time, waiting for the final moment to drag me back into that realm of ash. Either way, if you ever consider traveling to Mount Greylock alone, especially if you bring a loyal companion hoping for a safe, scenic weekend, remember what happened to me. Turn away. Drive home. Lock your doors. Because if you don't, the specter of that burned ranger might decide to devour your time, your reality, and your life, just as he did mine. And your dog might stop barking forever. My name is Matthew Taylor. I'm 33 years old, and this happened in October of 2024. I still remember the exact date I set out, October 16th, because it was supposed to be the start of a fresh chapter in my life, a cleansing of my cluttered mind. A few days out in the crisp autumn forest of western Massachusetts, just me and my dog Bruno, was supposed to free me from the dark spiral my life had taken. It's ironic how I wanted to escape the madness of the world, only to step into a nightmare that defied any sense of reality. I live in Springfield, Massachusetts, and before all this happened, I worked as a freelance web developer. The job had been going well for years, steady clients, flexible hours, until the spring, when the economy took a dip and my biggest client cut me loose. I tried to keep things afloat with smaller jobs, but my financial situation worsened fast. On top of that, my 3-year relationship ended in a messy split. My ex and I fought over the house we shared. Eventually, she won most of it in court, and I was left couch hopping with friends for a while. I didn't talk about it much with anyone, but the stress was killing me. That's when I decided to plan a getaway. A real, solid trip into nature to clear my head, gather my thoughts, and maybe jumpstart my motivation. I'd been reading about places to camp in Massachusetts. One name kept coming up: October Mountain State Forest. It's the largest state forest in the Commonwealth, located in the scenic Berkshires region, near the towns of Lee and Lenox. The pictures I'd seen online showed gorgeous tree-covered hills, winding trails, and quiet campsites. It sounded perfect. I packed up my battered SUV, loaded my gear: tent, sleeping bag, trekking poles, a small gas stove, freeze-dried meals, first aid kit, and brought along Bruno, my big, loyal Rottweiler. He's been with me for 4 years since I adopted him as a puppy. He's always been my protector, my shadow. If anyone could keep me safe out there, I figured it'd be Bruno. I arrived at the forest's main entrance in the early afternoon. It was strangely quiet. I'd half expected to see some day hikers or the occasional local fishermen. But the parking lot, if you could even call that small gravel clearing a parking lot, was empty. The only sign of life was a battered old truck that looked like it hadn't moved in months. I dismissed any weird feelings, convinced myself it was just off-season for tourism, or that I'd found a particularly remote corner of the forest. I left my phone plugged into the car charger for a final boost while I studied the trail map. At a glance, the plan was simple. Hike in 2 or 3 miles, set up my tent near one of the designated campsites, stay a night or two, then maybe move on to another site deeper in the woods if the weather held up. That was the plan, anyway. But from the very start, something felt off. The wind had a hollow whistle to it, not the usual gentle sway of trees. The forest floor seemed damp even though it hadn't rained in days. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in odd, slanting rays, as if the sun were perched lower in the sky than it should have been at midday. Bruno seemed uneasy, too. Usually, he's thrilled whenever we go hiking. He'll wag his stubby tail, sniff everything, run around excitedly. But that day, he stuck close to me, hackles bristling every few minutes. Still, I pressed on. I shouldered my backpack, clipped Bruno's leash to his harness just in case, and walked toward the trail. My phone showed me it was 1:45 p.m. As I passed the old truck, I glanced inside. Empty, except for a single black scarf lying on the driver's seat. Probably abandoned. I didn't think much of it then. The first hour of hiking was uneventful. Leaves crunched under my boots, the wind rustled the branches overhead, and occasionally I heard distant animal sounds, squirrels or chipmunks scurrying about. I found a scenic overlook that let me peer down into a small valley. The forest stretched out in a sea of reds, oranges, and yellows, autumn in full blaze. It would have been breathtaking if not for the vague sense of unease that kept creeping up my spine. Bruno stayed close, sniffing the air, whining occasionally. Then came the first annoyance. My phone died. One moment, it was at 92%. The next, the screen went black. I tried rebooting it, but it gave me a brief flicker of the battery icon before shutting down completely. That's weird, I muttered, more to reassure myself than anything. I'd literally just charged the phone. Bruno whined, as if echoing my concern. I told myself it was probably just a battery glitch. Phones do that sometimes. I decided to rely on my printed map and the GPS unit I'd brought just in case. That GPS device was an older model, but it usually did the job. About 15 minutes in, the GPS started glitching too. At first, the coordinates it displayed jumped around by 1/10 of a mile or so, making me think maybe the satellite signal was spotty. Then it placed me 7 miles south, near a totally different section of the forest. It kept blinking back and forth between those two spots. I tapped the plastic, shook it, tried fresh batteries, no luck. Eventually, it froze on a blank screen with faint lines that looked almost like spiderweb cracks. Come on, I hissed, more annoyed than fearful at that point. I took out my paper map. I'd planned my route carefully, follow the marked trail about 2 miles, then take a right at a fork that would lead to a small clearing by a stream, an official campsite. But the further I hiked, the less the trail resembled the one on my map. The forks didn't match the page. I found myself at a junction that wasn't labeled anywhere. The lines of the route seemed to shift every time I glanced at them. It made me question my sense of direction. Had I missed a sign? I checked my compass, still pointed north, at least that was consistent. So I took a guess, heading in what I thought was the correct direction. Bruno barked suddenly, the sound echoing sharply between the trees. "It's okay, buddy," I said, hoping I sounded confident. Not long after, as I trudged through a stand of tall pines, I came across the first truly bizarre sight. a circle of scorched earth, maybe 3 feet in diameter. All around it, the pine needles were intact, but right in the center, the ground looked blackened, covered in a thin layer of ash. I knelt to examine it. It smelled like sulfur or burnt hair. Bruno growled, then began to back away, pulling the leash taut, as if he couldn't stand being there. I was about to leave when I heard a voice from behind me. "Probably best not to linger," said a man in a friendly, if slightly wary tone. I spun around. There stood a tall man, maybe late 30s, wearing a worn-out hiking jacket and carrying a walking stick. He had stubble across his jaw, and his gaze was intense yet odd, as though he were analyzing me. He introduced himself as Carter Bell, and I introduced myself and Bruno. Carter said he'd been out here for a few days. He asked if we were alone. I told him, yeah, it was just me and the dog. He looked at Bruno with cautious respect. "That's a good dog," he said. "He'll keep you safe if you're smart about it." I remembered thinking that was a strange way to phrase it, if I'm smart about it. We chatted a bit, and he mentioned he knew these woods fairly well, that he was sort of touring different trails, living off the land as much as possible. Then he noticed the scorched patch of earth, the same as I had. "You see a few of these now and then," Carter said. "Locals say it's the devil's footprint." He shrugged with a half smile. "Who knows? Old superstition, maybe, but trust me, friend, you might want to camp closer to civilization before nightfall." I asked why. Carter gave a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes and said, "There's a lot of voices in these trees. They talk to themselves after dark." That answer set off all sorts of alarm bells in my head. Was this guy messing with me, or was he a local with a weird sense of humor? Before I could pry more details out of him, he excused himself, saying he had a campsite a few ridges over. "Good luck, Matthew," he said. "If you see me again, maybe I'll share a meal with you." Then he vanished into the forest. I decided it was time to find a spot and set up my tent. Weird atmosphere or not. It was nearing dusk. My watch read 5 p.m., but somehow the sky was already taking on that purple hue you usually see an hour before sunset. Bruno and I found a small clearing near a stand of birch trees. I didn't see an official campsite sign, but the space looked flat and sheltered. I laid out the tent, hammered in stakes, and tried to get a small fire going. That's when the fire started acting strangely. I used the same reliable lighter and tinder I always do. The flame took, at first, crackling happily. As darkness deepened, though, the flames shifted. Blue, green, then back to orange, like some chemical was burning in the wood. The wind kept gusting in inconsistent bursts, nearly snuffing it out. Eventually, I had a weak but serviceable campfire. I boiled water for a freeze-dried meal. Bruno wouldn't stop pacing around the campsite perimeter, occasionally growling at the darkness. When I checked my watch again, it was 6:30 p.m. The sky was pitch black, like midnight. I felt a chill up my spine that wasn't just the temperature dropping. I ate quickly, fed Bruno, and then crawled into my tent. Bruno curled up next to me. I felt safer with him there. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. My eyes kept flicking to the tent flap, half expecting Carter's silhouette or something else. At some point, I fell asleep. My dreams were chaotic. A swirl of voices, footsteps circling the tent, tree limbs bending down to claw at the fabric. I'd wake up to the sound of Bruno growling, only to see him fast asleep, chest rising and falling. Each time I drifted back under, the nightmares came again. Finally, near dawn, the exhaustion must have gotten to me because I slipped into a deeper slumber. When I awoke, it was bright out. Pale beams of morning sun illuminated my tent walls. Bruno wasn't beside me. At first, I panicked. Maybe he'd slipped under the tent flap in the night. but I then realized that my sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside. That alone might not have been alarming, but it was zipped up when I went to bed, and I hadn't left the tent. My arms and legs felt shaky. My head pounded as if from dehydration or a fever. I rubbed my eyes, sat up, and discovered Bruno outside, sniffing the ashes of the campfire which had been scattered. There were no footprints around it, as though a gust of wind had wiped everything clean, but the forest floor itself was undisturbed. I left the tent to check on Bruno. He seemed okay, tail wagging slightly, though his fur was puffed up. My phone was still dead, the GPS still broken. With no electronics to rely on, I decided to keep moving. Maybe try to circle back toward the parking area. Figure out where I'd gone wrong the day before. I was disoriented but convinced that heading south would at least get me somewhere near a road. Within an hour of hiking, I came across a small stream. The water was cold and clear. I refilled my bottles and let Bruno drink. I sat on a rock to rest, listening to the forest's quiet. That's when I saw the second sign of trouble. My backpack was ripped open. The seams on one side looked like they'd been torn by something incredibly sharp or strong. My spare socks, some food wrappers, and my lighter were scattered on the ground. Yet again, I found no footprints or any sign of an animal's presence around me, just the tracks that Bruno and I had made. It was like something had carefully shredded the pack while leaving no trace of itself. A wave of nausea rolled through me. This was no normal camping trip. My mind jumped to Carter. Could he be messing with me? But how would he do it so quietly, leaving no tracks, no sign? And anyway, that scorched circle I saw, that had to be something else, right? I forced myself to keep going. Bruno and I followed the stream, figuring eventually it'd lead us to a larger body of water or maybe a familiar trail. The sun climbed overhead, though it felt dimmer than usual, as if a constant haze dulled the light. Hours passed without any sign of civilization. My watch told me it was noon, then 1 p.m., then 3 p.m., and still no real break in the trees. I started to wonder if the watch was lying. The sky seemed stuck in a perpetual morning gloom. We pressed on. By the time I decided to stop for the day, the watch claimed it was 7 p.m., but the sky had only just begun to darken, which made no sense. I pitched camp anyway, near a fallen log. Bruno seemed agitated, sniffing the air and letting out low warning rumbles. I tried once more to build a fire. It refused to stay lit, sputtering out almost immediately no matter how much tinder or kindling I used. Finally, I gave up and ate a handful of granola and jerky. Bruno had some kibble from the bag that remained. I slid into my tent, physically drained, and prayed for an uninterrupted night's sleep. It was not to be. In the middle of the night, I heard footsteps, light, cautious, circling the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at the tent walls. The beam illuminated moving shadows outside. Bruno snapped awake and started growling, ears flattened. "Who's there?" I yelled. No response, just more circling. Then a voice called out from some distance away. "Matthew, help me! I'm lost!" The voice sounded like mine, yet distorted, as if played on an old tape recorder. It repeated the phrase twice, then fell silent. I clutched Bruno, my heart thundering. After a long stretch of quiet, I built up the courage to poke my head out of the tent. The forest was still. The only movement was the slight sway of tree branches. But the leaves on the forest floor around the tent had been arranged in hoof-shaped footprints, each blackened and smoldering like they'd been burned into the ground. The smell of sulfur hung in the air. At dawn, I decided I'd had enough of this. Real or not, I had to find my way back. If that meant bushwhacking until I reached a road, so be it. I hurriedly packed up. My gear was now ragged. The edges of the tent had dark burn marks and spots. Bruno's fur was standing on end the entire time. We marched west, checking the compass periodically. I was done trusting any trail or makeshift path. That's when I saw Carter Bell again, by a thick cluster of pines. He looked different, paler skin, dark circles under his eyes, movements that were slower, more deliberate. He greeted me with a slow, too-wide smile. "Well, we meet again, friend." His voice felt flatter, as though forced. I stared at him, heart pounding with suspicion. "Where have you been?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure why I thought he owed me an explanation. Carter blinked once, then answered, "All around. The nights are busy here, you know. The forest doesn't rest." Bruno let out a low growl. Carter ignored the dog and fixed his gaze on me. "You look worn out," he said in a maddeningly calm tone. "Maybe you should stay put to conserve your strength." I shivered, despite not feeling cold. "I'm getting out of here," I said. "I'm just trying to find the road or the ranger station. There's got to be something within a day's hike, right?" He studied me with that unblinking stare. "Oh, I don't think you'll make it that far. This place holds on to people." Then he nodded at Bruno. "That dog might make it if he's lucky." The threat implied in his words made my blood boil. "What do you want?" I snapped, fist clenching. Carter shrugged. "I'm just giving advice. The forest isn't kind to outsiders." That cryptic statement hanging in the air, he turned and walked off into the pines, his gait unnaturally stiff. Bruno barked at him, but Carter didn't so much as flinch. I was done playing this cat-and-mouse game. I marched the opposite direction, following the compass. Bruno stayed close by, occasionally whining. An hour later, I heard screaming from the distance. Harsh, pained screams echoing through the woods. It made me freeze in place. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. I owed nothing to Carter if it was him. But what if it was some other hiker? Guilt gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I left my main pack hidden behind a tree trunk, taking only my first aid kit, my flashlight, and my hunting knife for protection. I made Bruno stay close to me, speaking softly to keep him calm. We followed the sound. The screaming had tapered off into ragged moans. After a few minutes, we found Carter curled on the ground near a large boulder, covered in blood. I rushed forward, kneeling beside him. He was shivering. Deep gashes ran along his arms and torso as though something with claws had torn him up. The blood was thick, nearly black. There was a sharp, sulfuric odor mixed with the metallic tang of iron. Carter's eyes rolled in his head, then focused on me briefly. He tried to speak, but only coughed up a stream of black sludge. Inside that sludge, I saw bits of teeth, which made my skin crawl. It felt nightmarish. One part of me thought, he deserves it for messing with me. But some compassionate instinct kicked in. I tried to stop the bleeding, pressing gauze onto his wounds. "Carter," I said, "what happened?" He stared past me, a half-crazed look in his eyes. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached up, grabbed my wrist, and pulled me close. "It's hungry," he rasped, voice wet with blood. "In these woods. Old Red, he's never done with you, not until he's taken everything." Before I could ask who or what Old Red was, Carter started convulsing. His mouth gaped open and the scent of sulfur intensified. Bruno whimpered. Suddenly, Carter let out a rasping laugh and reached up to the side of his head. His fingernails dug into his scalp, and in a macabre display of self-mutilation, he tore off a chunk of skin and hair, revealing what looked like two small horn-like protrusions beneath. I recoiled, stumbling backward. Carter's laugh turned to a gurgle and he slumped. I wasn't sure if he was dead or just unconscious, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Bruno and I stumbled away, my mind reeling. Horns? I couldn't rationalize it. The forest took on a surreal haze, like a nightmare you can't wake from. I tried to get my bearings, but it felt as if every time I took 10 steps, I found myself back at the same clearing. The sounds of the woods, bird calls, rustling leaves, echoed in loops, repeating in rhythmic patterns that set my nerves on edge. Finally, I found my pack again by pure chance. I decided it was time for a more direct approach. If the forest was messing with me, I'd carve a path. I took out my hunting knife. The plan was to walk straight in a single direction, not following any trail. I started cutting into tree bark every dozen yards or so, leaving a mark. That way, I could tell if I was going in circles. For a while, it seemed to work. I marched on, marking trees behind me, cursing under my breath every time I got snagged on thorns or low branches. If not for Bruno, who trotted beside me, I might have given in to panic entirely. It must have been early evening. My watch said 3 p.m., but the sky was already darkening. I came across a second scorched patch of ground, larger than the first, maybe 5 or 6 feet wide. This time, the smell of sulfur was overwhelming, like rotten eggs burning. Next to it was a fresh set of footprints, hoof-shaped, definitely not from any animal I recognized. The prints were large, and they sank deep into the earth, as if whatever made them was immensely heavy. Bruno growled, then yelped, as though scalded by an invisible flame. I pressed on, heart hammering. The forest thickened around us. Tree trunks grew so close together that sometimes I had to turn sideways to squeeze through them. The evening air had a strange electric feel. When I came upon a large rock outcrop, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Bruno barked, the fur on his neck bristling. There was something on top of the outcrop, a shape with curved horns, glowing red eyes, the silhouette flickering like a mirage. Without thinking, I shouted, "Stay back!" My voice trembled. The shape vanished behind the rocks. I heard a low chuckle, or maybe the wind. I nearly collapsed from fear. Gathering what little courage I had, I continued forward. I reasoned that if I kept moving, maybe I could outrun this nightmare. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't something you outran. Night fell abruptly, as though someone flipped a switch. I scrambled to set up a makeshift camp, not even bothering with the tent poles. I draped the tent fabric over a branch and crawled underneath, trying to form a basic shelter. Bruno lay beside me, and I held him close, feeling his heartbeat. Neither of us really slept. Twigs cracked in the darkness. I heard rustling, then heavy thuds, as if something monstrous was stepping through the woods. Then, after an eternity, the first rays of dawn crept in. When I peered out, I noticed something awful. My marks on the trees were gone. The bark was smooth, untouched, as though I'd never carved any lines. That was the moment I started to break down. I felt tears well up, my stomach twisted in knots. I forced myself to eat some jerky to keep going. My supplies were diminishing faster than expected, too. Several packets of freeze-dried meals had turned rancid, covered in black mold, though they'd been sealed. My water supply was running low. The streams we passed that morning smelled foul. The water tinted a sickly green in some spots. I couldn't trust it. Bruno drank sparingly, but we were both parched. We walked for what felt like hours. At some point, I glanced at my watch. It read 3 a.m. That made no sense because it was daylight. I tapped it, shook it, held it up to my ear. Nothing. The watch was still ticking, but obviously showing the wrong time. My sense of day and night was unraveling. Maybe it was truly day. Maybe not. I lost track of how many hours we'd been hiking. My mind was a buzzing hive of confusion and dread. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a ring of large, moss-covered stones. Carter Bell stood in the center, leaning on his walking stick. His wounds were gone, his clothes not even stained with blood, as though the brutal injuries I'd seen the day before had never existed. Yet his face had changed, paler, with dark veins crawling under the skin near his temples. His eyes were glassy, and he hardly blinked. I approached cautiously, knife in hand. Bruno growled again. Carter greeted me with that same unnatural smile. "Matthew, you look tired," he said softly. "Maybe it's time to rest?" "Stay away from me," I hissed, raising the knife. He made no move to get closer. I felt something swirl in the air around me, that acrid smell of sulfur again, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse. Carter's mouth twitched. "You won't survive without a guide," he said, voice dripping with false sympathy. "The forest demands a toll for trespassing." I tried to speak, but words caught in my throat. Bruno started barking at Carter. Something in me snapped. I lunged forward, pressing the knife towards Carter's chest. I wanted answers. I wanted him to show me the way out. He didn't move to defend himself. Instead, he let the blade graze his shirt, then placed his hand over mine. I felt a searing heat, like my hand was on fire, and I jerked away. Carter's smile never faltered. "I can take you to Old Red," he said. "Then you'll see." Before I could stop him, Carter turned and walked deeper into the woods. Against all logic, I followed. He moved with eerie grace, weaving through thick underbrush and winding between tree trunks. Bruno stayed at my side, though his whining got worse. After about 10 minutes, we came upon another clearing, the largest scorched circle yet, spanning maybe 20 feet across. Everything in it was charred black. Embers glowed beneath a layer of ash. Carter stepped around the perimeter, then motioned for me to look into the center. It took me a moment to realize there was something standing there. A tall figure, hunched, with dark, cracked skin and cloven hooves. Its head was crowned with massive horns, and its eyes gleamed like dying coals. I froze in pure terror. This was impossible, a thing out of nightmares or demonic folklore. The smell of sulfur nearly choked me. The figure lifted its head, regarding me with an almost curious tilt. Then it spoke, in a gravelly voice that seemed to come from beneath the earth. "Matthew," it said, speaking my name with a horrifying clarity, "you have come far." It took a step forward. The earth beneath its hooves smoldered, sending up tiny flames that died just as quickly. I tried to back away, but Carter was behind me, blocking any escape. Bruno barked furiously, but I could tell he was terrified, tail tucked, body trembling. The creature, Old Red, if Carter's words were to be believed, stretched out a hand with elongated fingers. Its nails were pointed and black. The air around it crackled with energy, and I swore I felt the temperature spike 30 degrees. My vision blurred, tears stinging my eyes. I heard a high-pitched ringing that grew louder by the second. Then it spoke again, each syllable dropping like thunder. "You reek of fear, mortal. That is the flavor I favor." A primal survival instinct kicked in. I gripped my knife and lunged, aiming for the creature's face, or what I assumed was its face. It moved impossibly fast, stepping aside. My momentum carried me forward, and I nearly toppled into the scorched ground. A wave of heat battered me, searing my nostrils and lungs. Bruno barked and snapped at the creature's leg, but it kicked him aside with brutal force. Bruno yelped and tumbled. I snarled, adrenaline surging, and tried another swing. Old Red caught my wrist in a vice-like grip. Pain shot up my arm as though my bones were being crushed. I dropped the knife. The creature let out a rumbling laugh. Carter stood on the edge of the circle, watching with an impassive face. In that moment, I realized Carter wasn't just some random hiker. He was under this monster's control, or had become its servant somehow. Gathering every ounce of strength, I yanked my arm free. The skin on my wrist felt raw and blistered where it had grabbed me. I scrambled back, desperately searching for the knife. The creature advanced, each step sending up little wisps of flame from the ground. Just as it raised a hand to strike, Bruno leapt at it again, jaws clamping down on the creature's arm. Old Red howled in fury, shaking Bruno off. My dog flew through the air, landing on the ground with a sickening thud. "No!" I screamed, rushing to Bruno. He whimpered, struggling to stand. Blood dripped from his muzzle. That was enough to snap me into a frantic fury. I spotted the knife a few feet away, grabbed it, and lunged at Old Red once more. The beast swiped its claws at my face, and I felt burning lines cut across my cheek. But my knife struck home this time, plunging into one of its eyes. The creature unleashed a shriek that rattled the trees and rattled my very bones. Its eye oozed thick, tar-like fluid that hissed when it hit the scorched ground. Old Red staggered, swinging wildly, dislodging the blade. I saw an opening. I rushed to Bruno, scooping him up. Then I turned, ignoring the agony in my wrist and face, ignoring my battered body, and sprinted out of the clearing. Behind me, I heard Old Red's roars of pain and rage echoing through the forest. Trees cracked. I glanced back once. Carter stood there, expression contorted in some mix of awe and terror, as if even he hadn't expected me to wound that fiend. Then I lost sight of both of them in the gloom. I ran. I didn't care what direction. I just forced my legs to keep moving, carrying Bruno despite his weight. Time seemed to bend. My watch read random numbers: 1:15, 9:47, 4 o'clock, all in the span of minutes. The sky flickered between dawn and dusk. My mind felt fractured, but I kept going, fueled by sheer desperation. At some point, I realized we were heading downhill. That gave me hope. Downhill typically leads to roads or towns. My lungs burned, my limbs shook, but I refused to stop. Then, mercifully, I saw a dirt road in the distance. I stumbled out of the tree line, almost falling onto the gravel. My boots crunched on the stones, a glorious sound that meant civilization might not be far away. But behind me, I could still feel a presence, like the forest itself was alive, watching from the shadows, deciding whether to drag me back. I kept going. I had no idea what road it was, but it was a road. Bruno whimpered in my arms, and I tried to comfort him, tears streaking down my face. In my frantic state, I nearly walked right into a Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation truck that had just come around a bend. The driver slammed the brakes. I waved my arms, calling out, "Help, please!" The ranger, a woman in her mid-50s, jumped out, alarmed by my disheveled appearance. She saw Bruno's injuries and my bleeding face, and her expression turned grave. She radioed for help. Soon, an ambulance arrived. Paramedics loaded Bruno and me in. I clung to my dog's paw, terrified he was dying. Throughout it all, I kept expecting to see Carter or Old Red looming at the edge of the woods. But we pulled away. The forest shrank behind us, the gloom giving way to the bright lights of emergency vehicles. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I got closure. But the following hours were a blur. We ended up at Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield. Bruno was rushed to a veterinary clinic nearby. I had second-degree burns on my wrist and slash wounds on my cheek that required stitches. When I tried explaining what happened, the doctors and the police looked at me with polite skepticism. They asked if I'd been hallucinating. Perhaps I'd been attacked by a wild animal, a bear, or a large cat. As for Carter Bell, nobody by that name matched any missing persons report. The old truck I'd seen at the start was found, but it was registered to someone who died years ago. I eventually made my way back to Springfield, to the friend's couch I'd been sleeping on. Bruno recovered slowly. The vets patched him up, although he still has a limp. Now, when he sleeps, He sometimes whines and growls at unseen threats. He wakes up shaking, like he's recalling that monstrous being flinging him aside. I have nightmares every night. My phone never turned on again, despite multiple attempts to fix it. The watch I wore that day is stuck on 3 a.m., the second hand ticking uselessly in an endless loop. There's one last piece that keeps me from truly feeling safe. Sometimes, when I'm alone in a dark room, I swear I hear footsteps circling me, footsteps that end in a soft clop like hooves. I've smelled sulfur in my bedroom, just faintly, and found hoof-shaped scorch marks on my driveway one morning. It's as though the forest isn't done with me. Or maybe Old Red is biding his time, letting me think I escaped. Sometimes I even dream that Carter Bell is outside my window, smiling too broadly, waiting to whisper more ominous warnings in the voice that sounds almost like mine. I haven't dared go near October Mountain State Forest since. If I ever do, it won't be by choice. I keep telling myself that somehow I did real damage to Old Red, that jabbing my knife into that fiery socket was enough to drive it away. But in the deepest recesses of my mind, I know evil like that doesn't simply vanish. It might lurk in every shadow at the corner of my vision, waiting for the right moment to step back into my life with hoofprints and sulfuric breath. So that's my story. How a simple trip to clear my head turned into an encounter with something I can't fully explain. Something that shouldn't exist in any rational world, but does. My name is Matthew Taylor, and I'm 33 years old. Bruno is still with me, loyal as ever, though we both walk a little slower now. Some nights, when the wind howls, I can't help but picture that scorched circle of earth, the smell of burning, and the towering outline of Old Red. I remind myself it all might be over, but there's always that gnawing doubt telling me that if it wants me, it will come again. And next time, I might not have the luck to escape. My name is Megan Shaw, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in July of 2023, and I still wake up every night sweating, convinced I can hear those screams echoing through the darkness. I wish I could go back to the moment when I agreed to this trip, but I can't. All I can do is share my story, hoping it warns somebody else not to make the same mistakes. I'm a freelance wildlife photographer. Not a soldier, not a veteran, not some hardcore survivalist. My knowledge of the outdoors came from hundreds of casual camping weekends, a few photography workshops, and plenty of nature documentaries. Nothing about me screamed hardened adventurer, but I was always comfortable in the wild. When I needed an escape from city life, I would head for the trees, searching for animals to capture in my lens. No matter how lonely or dark the woods got, I always believed I'd find my way back out. That belief was fractured a few months ago when I discovered my fiancé of 6 months had been cheating on me with one of my closest friends. My self-confidence imploded, and for weeks I couldn't bring myself to pick up my camera or even leave my apartment. In my sorrow, I almost gave up photography entirely. Ironically, it was my college friend Rachel Myers who insisted we take a trip to the woods to help me heal. She claimed I needed to reconnect with nature, and maybe reconnect with the part of myself that felt missing. Rachel's suggestion was to head to the Quabin Reservoir area in Massachusetts, specifically near the old, drowned town site of Dana. Once a thriving small town, Dana was abandoned and submerged in the 1930s to create the reservoir. Ruins and cellar holes still dotted the forest. Something about a half-lost, half-forgotten place appealed to me, and I agreed. She even joked that if I wanted to capture unique shots, photographing a drowned town in the middle of the wilderness would be perfect. The idea of those ghostly remains under the water was weirdly captivating. So that's how we found ourselves driving west on a sweltering morning, with my golden retriever Scout poking his head out the back window. I watched the highway turn into winding side roads, then narrower dirt paths that twisted deeper into dense Massachusetts forest. The plan was to park near one of the old trails and hike to a secluded spot near where Dana's outskirts once stood, camp for a few nights, and explore. We arrived at an unofficial trailhead, really just a rough break in the undergrowth. The battered sign read, "No trespassing," in peeling paint, but Rachel brushed it off, pointing out that many trails in the area had misleading or outdated markings. And to be fair, neither of us was prone to obey every "keep out" sign if we believed there was a good story or a great photo on the other side. Rachel was 30, just 2 years older than me. We'd become close in college, bonding over midnight coffee binges and a shared adventurous streak. She was usually effervescent and talkative, the type who could chat up a random hiker about everything from yoga to quantum physics. She was also more spiritual than I was, prone to humming little tunes or burning sage to cleanse bad vibes. Normally, I teased her for it, but I'd grown to appreciate her optimism. It was early afternoon when we started walking, each wearing large packs stuffed with camping gear and enough supplies for 4 or 5 days. Scout, tail wagging, bounded ahead, sniffing the mossy ground and panting in excitement. I felt a twinge of hope that maybe this trip was exactly what I needed to move on. For a little while it even felt good. Sunlight speckled the ground. Leaves crunched under our boots. Birds called overhead. But after an hour or so, my phone's battery plummeted from 80% to 15% in about a minute. Initially, I thought it was just the old phone acting up. Then, Rachel complained her battery was dropping too. She fiddled with her phone, but it froze and died, refusing to turn back on. The spotty GPS had pinned us in the middle of the reservoir, a place we obviously weren't. I chalked it up to poor reception and the phone's battery quirks, but an uneasy feeling tugged at me. Scout whined softly, ears perked. I told him it was okay, but I wasn't so sure. We consulted our paper map, which we'd bought at a local bookstore. Unfortunately, the trail we were on wasn't marked clearly. The contour line suggested we should be heading downhill, but instead we seemed to be climbing. Twice we encountered splits in the path that didn't appear on any map. The trees felt older and more oppressive the farther we went. Still, we pushed on, determined to find a suitable campsite before nightfall. By late afternoon, we finally reached a spot with old stone foundations, half buried under years of leaves and earth. A few rusted metal beams poked up from the ground like jagged teeth, and what looked like the remains of a small cemetery lay scattered among the trees, worn gravestones leaning at precarious angles. We'd stumbled upon the outskirts of Dana. "This is intense," Rachel murmured, running a hand over a chipped headstone that read only "Mother." She gazed around with a somber reverence I didn't expect. Even the air felt heavier here, as if the forest was holding its breath. Despite the eerie atmosphere, we found a relatively open clearing not far from the cemetery. We set up our tents and started a small fire, but something was off from the start. The kindling refused to catch, and when it finally did, the flames danced with a bluish tint, emitting little heat. Rachel joked about cursed witches and haunted grounds, and I forced a laugh, trying to brush aside the crawling sensation on my neck. Night descended faster than normal, or so it seemed. By the time we finished our meager dinner of noodles and jerky, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the trees in an inky blackness. I snapped a few pictures with my DSLR using a headlamp to illuminate the campsite. To my confusion, the camera's timer feature glitched. Some of the images had timestamps hours ahead of real time. One photo apparently recorded the date as 3 days in the future. I showed Rachel, half expecting her to share my alarm, but she shrugged. attributing it to electronics gone haywire. At around midnight, we turned in. Scout curled up at my feet, his body warmth comforting against the chilling night air. I remember looking at my watch, 11:57 p.m., and thinking, tomorrow's going to be better. That was the last comforting thought I had for a while. I awoke to a high-pitched wail rolling across the reservoir. It sounded like a woman screaming, but stretched out and echoey, as though it were bouncing off invisible walls. The hair on my arms and neck rose instantly. Scout growled, a low and menacing rumble I'd never heard from him. I glanced at my watch, but the display showed 6:66 a.m. and then flickered off. My stomach flip-flopped. Rachel unzipped her tent and peered out wide-eyed. Foxes, maybe. They can sound like that, she offered. But her face told me she didn't fully believe her own words. The wailing faded, replaced by the sudden hush of the forest. Not even crickets made a sound. It was as if the whole area was holding its collective breath. When morning finally came, I found my sleeping bag unzipped from the inside, lying in the dirt several feet from my tent. My foot was covered in mosquito bites, and I had no memory of getting out. Worse, my backpack was also gone. We eventually found it a dozen yards into the woods, half buried in leaves. Everything inside was intact except for my bag of trail mix, which had apparently molded overnight into a foul green sludge. My first thought was raccoons or bears, but the bag was neatly zipped up again. That made no sense. I tried to keep my panic under control as we made breakfast over our strangely pale fire. Rachel attempted a reassuring smile, but she was clearly rattled. Scout refused to eat, which was incredibly unusual. He stared into the trees, hackles raised, growling in a soft, continuous hum that set me on edge. I had never seen my dog act like that in all our years together. We decided to explore some of the old foundations in the daylight, get a few photographs, and maybe find a vantage point of the reservoir. If we could find the shore, we could orient ourselves better. The undergrowth was thick and the forest felt labyrinthine. At one point I realized we'd doubled back to the same moss-covered boulder 3 times, even though we were trying to walk in a straight line. The paper map I'd pinned to my camera bag made even less sense now. Every time I glanced at it, it looked different, as though the lines had shifted. The route I'd highlighted the night before was gone. Eventually, we came upon a low stone wall that partially encircled a depression in the ground, probably a cellar hole. Ivy spilled over the edges, and the stone steps leading down looked slick and decayed. I was about to step closer when I noticed a scattering of dog tracks in the mud near the entrance. At first, I thought Scout had gotten ahead of us, but he was right beside me. The prints were fresh, yet not from Scout's paws. They were slightly smaller and spaced oddly, like the dog had been walking on 2 legs part of the time. "Let's keep moving," Rachel whispered, shifting her gaze between me and the hole. Her face was pale. I nodded, swallowing the nervous lump in my throat. Around midday, Rachel said she wanted to look for more firewood, hoping maybe we'd find dry branches that would produce normal flames. She insisted I stay put to organize camp. I was hesitant, but we needed the wood, and I still trusted Rachel. Scout stayed behind with me, and we rummaged through our gear, discarding items that had gone inexplicably rotten overnight. Crackers turned green with mold, apples liquefied in their skins. The water in one of our canteens tasted rancid, as if it had been sitting stagnant for months. My gut clenched with unease, but I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe a small tear in the packaging. Maybe it was just a freak coincidence. What I couldn't explain was the warping sensation in my head, as though time were slipping through my fingers. I'd check my camera's digital clock, see it read 2:13 p.m., look away for a minute, and when I glanced back it would show 11:48 a.m., My watch was completely dead now. Meanwhile, Rachel had been gone far too long, well over 2 hours. I debated going after her, but I worried we'd both get lost in different directions. I called her name repeatedly, my voice echoing in the silent woods. Scout grew agitated, pawing at the ground, whining. Finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. I pulled on my boots and grabbed a flashlight. Though it was broad daylight, the canopy of trees was so thick it felt like dusk in some places, and ventured in the direction she'd gone. I didn't have to go far before stumbling upon her. She was standing by a half-decayed tree trunk, arms cradling a pile of damp twigs. She looked over at me with a too-wide smile, her eyes dark, almost vacant. She didn't speak at first, just stared. When I asked if she was okay, she replied with a voice that felt stilted, like each word had to be yanked out of her throat. "I'm fine, Meg," she said, blinking too seldom. Then she paused and added, "Why are you out here?" in a tone that felt oddly accusatory. I told her she'd been gone for hours. She insisted it had only been 10 minutes. And then she cocked her head, gave a weird little laugh, and said she had found wonderful wood. I glanced at the pathetic twigs she was holding, clearly wet, borderline useless. It was as if she had no idea how to collect proper kindling. In the middle of this bizarre interaction, she suddenly asked, "Are you going to take a photo or not?" The question came out of nowhere, and her voice was deeper, hoarser. She even used a condescending tone, something Rachel rarely did. Then, just like that, she gave that too-wide smile again and turned to walk back to camp, leaving me thoroughly unsettled. Back at the clearing, we tried making a fire with her wonderful wood, but it smoked horribly and refused to catch. By then, the day had felt like an eternity of confusion. I wanted to leave, but we weren't even sure which direction was out. My phone was long dead, and Rachel's couldn't be turned on. I tried to keep calm, telling myself we could retrace the path we arrived on. Except the memory of that route was hazy in my mind, and the forest was resisting my attempts to map it mentally. That night, Scout started growling the moment the sun dipped behind the trees. The fire spat sparks of eerie blue and green hues, almost chemical in color. We had a dinner of half-stale snacks, the only food that hadn't rotted or been tainted somehow. My appetite had vanished anyway, replaced by a deep unease in my gut. I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was watching me even as we spoke. She seemed jumpy, her eyes flickering toward the darkest corners of the woods. We eventually crawled into our tents. I kept Scout with me, praying for dawn. Sleep was elusive, but exhaustion won out at some point. I don't remember drifting off, only the oppressive weight of a nightmare, where the walls of the old Dana buildings enclosed around me like a tomb. I jolted awake when my tent flap rustled. My heart hammered as I shone a flashlight around. My sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside again, lying partly outside the tent. Scout was gone. I stumbled out, calling his name, and discovered a trail of blood along the ground, leading into the thick brush. Tears blurred my eyes. I dashed after the blood, flashlight trembling in my hand. He was nowhere to be found. I tried to remain logical. Maybe Scout had chased some animal and gotten injured. But what about the fact that the sleeping bag had been unzipped? Could Scout have done that on his own? My mind churned with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Rachel's tent was empty, but her boots were still inside. I felt dread coiled tighter in my chest. As I circled back to the camp, I spotted Scout's collar near one of the stone foundations. The metal latch was bent, as if wrenched open by brutal force. A smear of fresh blood streaked the collar. I tried to keep from panicking. I called for Rachel, but only my echo responded. The tension in the air was suffocating. After maybe an hour of fruitless searching, I heard Rachel's voice drifting through the trees, calling my name. "Megan, over here." She sounded casual, friendly, too friendly. When I found her, she was standing in front of a rotted, half-collapsed cellar entrance, the same one we'd seen the previous day. She was staring down into the darkness, her flashlight pointed inside. "Rachel, my dog, did you see Scout?" I demanded. She turned slowly, shining her flashlight in my face. "He's fine," she said, but no relief touched her eyes. "I saw him, he went away." Her voice quivered and she smiled, a horrifying expression that pulled her lips too tight. "He's almost ready," she whispered, eyes flicking toward the stone steps. "We all are." Something was terribly wrong with her. My heart pounded as I took a step back, urging her to leave the area with me to help me look for Scout more thoroughly. She turned on me and hissed, an actual hiss, like a feral creature. Then she lunged with surprising speed, wielding a rusty nail clutched in her right hand. I stumbled and felt the metal gouge into my leg, a flash of hot pain shooting up my thigh. I kicked her away, and she slammed against a crumbling stone wall. For a moment, her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness. I stood there, panting, blood running down my leg. The second she went limp, everything went silent again. It was as if the forest pressed pause on all ambient noise. I should have run then and there, but I couldn't leave her. We'd been friends for years, and even if something dreadful had taken hold of her mind, I couldn't just abandon her. Hobbling, I grabbed some rope from my pack back at camp and returned to find her stirring groggily, muttering incoherently. I tied her to a sturdy sapling near the clearing, my hands trembling. When she fully came to, she looked normal again, or tried to. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she sobbed, pleading for me to let her go. She said she had no memory of the past few hours, that something was inside her, controlling her. She insisted she felt it twisting her thoughts, making her watch helplessly from within. I remembered the vicious slash of that nail, the mania in her smile, but my own guilt gnawed at me. This was still Rachel. Maybe she was just having a breakdown, psychologically unmoored by the strange events. We were both exhausted, starved, and terrified. Surely it was a psychotic break, right? I crouched beside her, pressing gauze to the gash in my leg and wincing. She began trembling. "Meg, it's in me. I need help." Her voice sounded so genuine, so close to the old Rachel. Against my better judgment, I untied her. She lunged again, this time biting into my hand with animal fury, her teeth crunching into the flesh near my thumb. I screamed and instinctively backhanded her, sending her sprawling to the ground. She cackled, a raw, guttural sound that didn't belong in a human throat, then scrambled away on all fours into the night, leaving me in shock and agony. Blood poured from the bite wound, and I stood there shuddering, half limping back to my tent. I had minimal medical supplies, just a first aid kit with disinfectant and bandages. The pain blazed, and I felt dizzy, nearly fainting. For a while I considered leaving immediately, but I was afraid to run into Rachel in the dark forest. Instead, I huddled in my tent, biting back tears, hoping morning would bring clarity. I woke to a faint glow in the sky, stiff and in agony. My leg was hot and swollen, my hand throbbing. My entire body ached from fear and exhaustion. That's when I discovered my supply of painkillers and antibiotic ointment had rotted into a black sludge overnight. Impossible to use. My bottle of water stank like sulfur. I nearly vomited from the stench. Moving gingerly, I resolved to get out of there if it killed me. I'd heard talk of a ranger station or a caretaker's shack somewhere along the reservoir's edge. If I could just find the water line, I could skirt around until I reached a more populated area. I packed what little I had left that wasn't destroyed or tainted. As I was about to leave, I heard a noise behind me. I whirled around, adrenaline spiking, to see Scout limping into the clearing. Relief crashed over me, only to be smothered by dread the moment he looked up. His eyes were glazed, milky white, and he made a low, guttural snarl I'd never heard before. Blood coated his muzzle, dried into the fur around his mouth. I called his name softly, stepping closer, but he bared his teeth. The dog I knew was gone, replaced by something feral, or worse. He lunged, biting at my injured leg. I cried out, staggered away, and in that desperate moment I grabbed the nearest solid object, one of our broken hiking poles, and drove it into his throat. He let out a choking gurgle, collapsed to the ground, and twitched a few times before falling still. I dropped to my knees, sobbing uncontrollably, apologizing over and over to my loyal companion. I could barely breathe through the guilt and grief. But if I hadn't done it, he would have killed me. I kept telling myself that. I told myself there was no more Scout, only a shell housing something evil. With tears burning my eyes, I limped out of the clearing. It was still early morning, but the sun's rays barely penetrated the dense canopy, giving the forest a gray, sorrowful cast. The map was useless, but I had a vague idea of where the reservoir might be in relation to Dana's ruins. I pushed in a general northeast direction, hoping to catch sight of the water soon. Yet the forest distorted around me. I walked for an hour, then 2, then 3, without any sign of the shoreline. Instead, I found myself encountering more half-sunken ruins, rusted car frames, fragments of chimneys. Once I spotted a tattered sign that read Dana Town Line near a broken fence, but as I blinked, it seemed to vanish. My sense of time went haywire. My injuries throbbed, and I started to wonder if I was losing my mind to infection or shock. My watch was beyond dead, and my camera's clock was reading wild nonsense. 11:59, then 5:02, then 12:72. My concept of day or night was unmoored. At some point, I stumbled onto a faint path that looked man-made, with the undergrowth beaten down. My heart lifted, thinking it might lead me out. Instead, it led me to Rachel. She stood in the center of the path, still wearing her battered hiking clothes, but her hair was matted with mud and leaves. Blood, some fresh, some dried, streaked her face. Her eyes were wide and dilated, and she was grinning like a mannequin with a painted mouth. When she spoke, it was a low rasp. "You're still here. We can't leave. It won't let us." I backed away, hand gripping the broken hiking pole so hard my knuckles whitened. "Stay back," I warned. "I'll do whatever I have to do." Rachel cocked her head like a curious animal, eyes flicking to the blood on my leg, the wound on my hand. "It wants your blood," she crooned in that same eerily deep voice, "and you'll give it just like I did." I realized she was cradling something. It took me a moment to see it clearly. It was a length of Scout's fur, clumps of it. My stomach lurched. Rage and fear mingled in a dizzying wave. She had something to do with my dog's fate, and God only knew what exactly had happened to him before he attacked me. I feinted to the left, trying to slip past her on the right, but she lashed out with shocking speed, slashing at my already injured leg with a short blade, maybe a piece of sharpened metal from the ruins. Pain ripped through me, and I crashed to the ground, blood seeping into my sock. Rachel jumped on top of me, trying to force the blade toward my throat, but I managed to keep it at bay by clamping my hands around her wrist. Her strength was unnaturally amplified. She giggled, pressing her face close to mine. Her breath smelled of decay, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Desperate, I brought my knee up into her groin, dislodging her momentarily. I shoved her off and scrambled to my feet. She came at me again, but I swung the hiking pole, catching her across the side of the head. She went down with a strangled yelp. For a moment, she lay dazed, blood trickling from her temple, and then she started sobbing, sounding like a small child, saying over and over, "I'm sorry, Meg. I'm so sorry. Please, help me." I stood over her, breathing raggedly, the pole raised. My hand shook, slick with sweat and blood. For a moment, I thought she might really be back to normal. Then her lips peeled into that grin and she flung herself at me, teeth bared. I thrust the broken pole forward in pure self-defense, impaling her in the throat. Her body spasmed in a violent arc, blood spraying. Her eyes bulged as she clutched at the pole, mouth working soundlessly. I kicked her back and she tumbled away, the pole still jutting from her neck. A black sludge oozed out around the wood, mixing with her blood in a foul, tar-like stream. Her body writhed, arms and legs twisting at impossible angles, until she finally went still. A wave of horror crashed over me. I fell to my knees, fighting back bile. That was my friend, or at least it used to be. I stared at the corpse, half expecting it to sit up again. But it didn't. Once the initial shock ebbed, I felt only raw emptiness. My leg was in terrible shape, throbbing with each heartbeat. I limped onward, tears streaming down my face, leaving Rachel's body behind me, or what was left of her. My only goal was to survive. I told myself if I kept moving north, eventually I'd find the reservoir's edge or a real trail. Hours blurred together. The forest grew darker, even though it should have been midday. My vision swam with fatigue and blood loss. My hands shook. The only thing that propelled me was a desperate will to live and an unshakable sense that something was behind me, tracking me, maybe the force that had possessed Rachel and corrupted Scout. Eventually, I came across what looked like a park ranger's shack hidden behind a tangle of bushes. The windows were cracked, and the structure's wooden siding was covered in moss, but it was shelter. I stumbled up the rotted steps, forced the door open with my shoulder, and nearly collapsed inside. The interior was dusty, filled with old supplies. A battered first aid kit hung on one wall. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I yanked the kit open, rummaging for anything useful. Luckily, the disinfectant and some bandages were still intact, though the kit had clearly been untouched for years. My hands trembled as I poured disinfectant on the bite on my hand and the gashes on my leg. The pain was excruciating, but I welcomed it as a sign that I was still alive. A flare gun with 2 flares sat in a cabinet. I grabbed it, along with an old can of kerosene I found near what might have once been a wood stove. My mind raced. If something came for me, I might have a fighting chance. I wanted to signal for help, but I had no idea if there was anyone within miles who would see it. I settled for survival, at least for the moment. Sometime in the gloom of that shack, I drifted off. When I woke, the world outside was pure black, no hint of moonlight or stars. It seemed the entire sky had vanished. I tried the shack's door, locked it, barricaded it with a broken table. My leg was still throbbing, and I was running a fever. I was torn between trying to rest until dawn or pushing on through the night. Fear of the dark forest warred with fear of being cornered in a cramped building if something found me. As if on cue, I heard scratching at the door. My heart thundered. The scratching continued, followed by a low, throaty moan, almost like a wounded animal. Then I heard a voice. "Megan, Megan," and my blood ran cold. It was Rachel's voice, or something mimicking it. Gently, it tried the door handle. I whispered to myself that I had killed her. I'd seen the life drain from her eyes. The persistent rattle of the handle told me that didn't matter. Whatever wore my friend's face might still be out there. My hand clenched around the flare gun. After a moment, the handle stopped rattling. Silence returned, heavy and thick. Then came a sound from the window, a light tapping, as if fingernails or claws were testing the glass. I aimed the flare gun at the darkness, my heart in my throat. The tapping stopped. I wanted to burn the entire forest down. That irrational thought pulsed in my mind. If I torched everything, maybe I could kill whatever evil lurked among these trees. Then I realized I had that can of kerosene. Fueled by desperation and adrenaline, I unbarricaded the door and burst outside with the can, the flare gun in my other hand. I didn't see anything immediately, but the forest shadows danced with potential threats. I hobbled along the perimeter of the shack, sloshing kerosene on the walls, tears streaming down my face. If something tried to get in, I would set the building ablaze and hope I could slip away in the confusion. The plan was insane, but I had no better ideas. I crouched, waiting in the darkness. Minutes passed like hours. Nothing. Eventually, I decided I needed to move, to find my way to civilization before I bled out or starved. I turned to leave, and Rachel, or the thing wearing her face, stood at the edge of the clearing, head cocked at an unnatural angle, eyes reflecting no light. Blood caked her chin, and the broken pole still protruded from her neck. She raised a twisted arm, beckoning me closer. With a trembling hand, I flicked open the flare gun and aimed. She stepped forward, opening her mouth in a silent scream. I fired. The flare struck her chest, igniting a sudden burst of flame. She screeched, a horrifying shriek of agony and something else. Rage, maybe. Fire danced around her body as she flailed. I dropped the can of kerosene, and the liquid spilled onto the ground, blazing as the flames spread. She collapsed to her knees, thrashing wildly, but even as she burned, she scrabbled toward me. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. With a final burst of strength, I kicked her backward into the flames. She went up like a torch. My mind reeled in horror. The fire began to spread to the shack, to the undergrowth. I seized that chance to stumble away, half limping, half running, my body screaming in protest. My only thought was to get as far from that place as possible. The forest lit up behind me in a hellish glow. Somewhere, in my feverish haze, I imagined I heard other screams echoing from different corners of the woods, as if the entire night was alive with tortured souls. I must have been delirious because I remember images in flashes, the burning trees, the roar of flames, the acrid smell of smoke. A sense of time losing all meaning again, my footsteps repeating an endless slog. At some point, dawn arrived in the form of a dull gray light. The fire must have died out or been contained by the dampness of the foliage. I was so weak I could barely move, but I kept forcing myself forward. By midday, assuming it was midday, I crested a small ridge and finally saw the glimmer of the reservoir through the trees. Relief momentarily overrode the pain. I half stumbled, half slid down the slope until I reached the water's edge. My reflection in the water startled me. Pale, hollow-eyed, blood-caked. I looked like a walking corpse. But the shore meant I could follow it, maybe reach the main road or find a boat. I don't remember how long I followed that shoreline, maybe hours, maybe days. But eventually, I spotted the silhouette of a small house near the water, well outside the main Quabin restricted zone. Collapsing onto the muddy ground, I shouted with the last scrap of my energy. A figure came running out, an older man dressed in everyday clothes. A real person, with a real face. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew I was in an ambulance. An oxygen mask strapped over my nose and mouth. A paramedic was shouting to me, but I couldn't make out the words. When I regained consciousness for real, I was in a hospital bed. They told me I'd suffered severe blood loss and infection, that my leg might have permanent nerve damage. Police questioned me about Rachel, about what happened in the Quabin woods. I told them the truth, or tried to. The looks they gave me ranged from skeptical pity to outright disbelief. They eventually launched a search for Rachel, found no trace of her or a body. They did discover signs of a fire near an old ranger shack, along with charred remains that might have been human bones. They never confirmed any identity. In the weeks that followed, I recovered physically, but the nightmares never left. Sometimes I dreamed of Scout, whimpering in a black void. Sometimes I saw Rachel's blazing figure lurching toward me, mouth twisted in that grisly smile. I gave up my photography for a while. Even the sound of a shutter click triggered flashbacks. I don't know what truly lurks in the drowned town of Dana, or what force seemed to corrupt my friend and dog. Some nights, in my half-sleep, I think I hear the screams drifting from the corners of my room, or the tapping of fingernails on glass. The doctors say it's trauma. The police have closed the case, labeling it an unsolved tragedy. But I can't forget the final images on my camera's SD card, which I checked months later. Pictures of me asleep in my tent, taken from outside, the flash reflecting off the polyester. The timestamps were dated 2 days after I left the woods. There's no explanation. I just know I'll never set foot near the Quabin Reservoir again. That's my story. I share it with the faint hope that if anyone else feels drawn to that haunted, abandoned place, they'll think twice, because there's something wrong in that forest, something that warps time and bends minds, and no amount of logic or reason can protect you from it. If you go, I pray you find a way out, because if you don't, it might claim you the way it claimed my friend, my dog, and almost claimed me. And if you do make it out, you might wonder, for the rest of your life, if it followed you home. My name is Kyle Morgan, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in May of 2022, deep in the heart of western Massachusetts, at a forgotten campsite in Savoy Mountain State Forest. For all my years as a middle school science teacher, a profession that grants me boundless curiosity, I never believed I'd be writing about something that defied every principle of logic and reality I hold dear. But here I am, still trying to make sense of what occurred in those cursed woods. I was on sabbatical that spring, driving an old 1989 RV I'd bought at a yard sale. I named her Greta, after my grandmother, who taught me to appreciate the old ways of traveling. I had a plan: spend a few months exploring quiet places in America, finishing a chapter of a book I'd been writing about how modern noise and technology isolate us more than connect us. I hoped to find a perfectly silent patch of forest, away from highways, away from phone towers. Somewhere I could just be. My research led me to a post on a defunct travel blog describing a deserted campsite near Borden Mountain in the Savoy Mountain State Forest. The blogger mentioned it had been shut down by the state years ago due to poor maintenance. No rangers patrolled it regularly, and it was rumored to be a place where you could find absolute stillness. It sounded perfect. Maybe a little too perfect. I arrived on a windy afternoon. The forest was silent in that deep, hushed way you only find in remote areas. The wind hissed through pines that towered overhead, their shadows bending like twisted silhouettes. Greta bumped along a barely discernible gravel path, and I had to be careful not to clip the low-hanging branches. By the time I located what seemed like the campsite, an overgrown clearing ringed by towering pines, the sun had dipped behind heavy clouds. No official signs, no markers, and no other human presence. The ground was strewn with rotting pine needles and old fire rings filled with the damp ash. It struck me as a ghost of a campground, the kind you'd hear about on an urban legends forum. But I was determined. I wanted privacy, and I certainly had it. I parked Greta on the flattest patch of gravel and surveyed my surroundings. A rusted old fire tower rose from a ridge about a quarter-mile away, just visible through the pines. The tower looked precarious, missing sections of its railing, but it also intrigued me. I had a habit of investigating any local oddities wherever I camped, partly for the sense of adventure and partly for possible reference in my writing. The first day was uneventful. After leveling the RV and hooking up my portable generator, I took a short walk with my phone's GPS turned off, on purpose, to measure the true silence. I was delighted at how non-existent the ambient noise was. My last known phone signal had been nearly an hour away on the main road, so I knew I was good and disconnected. Exactly how I wanted it. Later, as I sat at the small fold-out table inside Greta and typed up notes on my laptop, a strange mechanical humming buzzed in my left ear. At first, I assumed the generator was misfiring, but the hum seemed to come from outside. I turned off the generator to listen. The hum went silent. Confused, I shrugged it off as the wind swirling in the pines or my ears adjusting to the emptiness. I cooked a quick dinner of pasta over my tiny propane stove and crawled into the built-in bunk bed, marveling at how dark it was out there. Living in a city my whole life, I'd rarely seen total blackness. Yet the forest outside was a void. No stars, thanks to the heavy clouds, no moon. Just an emptiness that pressed against Greta's windows. I slept like a log until something stirred me awake in the small hours. The mechanical hum had returned. I flicked on the overhead light, which buzzed weakly. My watch read 3:12 a.m. The hum was slightly louder now, a low resonance that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't the wind. It sounded almost like an electrical transformer, but there was no reason for one to be out here. Heart pounding, I checked my surroundings. The stove was off, the lights were off, the generator was off. Still, the hum carried on. I crept to Greta's window, parted the curtains, and peered into the gloom. Initially, I saw nothing. Then, in the distance, beyond the ring of pine trees that enclosed the clearing, I caught a ripple of bluish-white light shifting among the tree trunks. It looked like it was dancing. My first thought was aurora, but that made no sense in Massachusetts, especially at 3 a.m. in May. The swirl of light was mesmerizing, flickering between the boles of trees. I had an urge to open the RV door and walk straight to it, but some primal caution held me back. Eventually, my exhaustion prevailed, and I crawled back into bed, determined to figure it out in daylight. When morning came, I found only the usual forest, no sign of anything unnatural. The hum was gone as well. I ate breakfast, dressed, and decided to do some exploring. I brought along a small backpack with a first aid kit, water, and a notebook in which I jotted down daily observations. I followed a faint footpath heading toward the ridge where I'd seen the rickety fire tower. The walk was eerie but peaceful. Shafts of sunlight cut through the tall pines, revealing drifting motes of dust and pollen. After maybe 15 minutes, I reached the tower's base. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a rusted mailbox affixed to a rotting wooden post near the tower's foot. The post read, Savoy Empton Ranger Station, Tower 4, though station was a generous word for what was basically a metal scaffold. The mailbox door was ajar, and inside I found a water-damaged logbook wrapped in plastic. It looked old, with pages stuck together and mold creeping around the edges. Curious, I peeled it open, scanning the entries. It seemed to be a ranger log from about 15 years ago, used by whoever manned this tower. The first few pages described routine tasks, checking for forest fires, counting hikers on the trails, logging weather patterns. The later entries grew sparse, scrawled in a shaky hand. Heard a humming again last night. Thought it was the generator, but we have no generator up here. Lights behind the pines, blue flickers. Reported it, but HQ says no atmospheric anomalies. Something's not right. Bob left a week ago. Not sure if he'll come back. The tower's quiet now. I can't sleep. They're calling it an Aurora Man? Some local hikers told me it's an old legend. They joked about it. Didn't sound like a joke to me. The final entry. Feels like I'm not alone. He's not leaving. He glows blue. A chill crawled across my scalp. The references to humming and blue light matched my own experience. But how could an Aurora Man exist in this region? It sounded too bizarre to be real. Maybe these rangers were lonely, or stressed, or had encountered some meteorological phenomenon. Real or not, I tucked the logbook in my bag to read more later and left the mailbox as I'd found it. An impulse tugged at me to climb the tower, but the structure wobbled ominously in the breeze. Several steps were missing. I decided to be cautious and not risk a broken neck. Instead, I circled around to see if there were any remnants of a true station. All I found were 4 rusted stakes in the ground where a small cabin might have stood. The sense of isolation was profound. Even the birds were silent. I returned to camp in the early afternoon, startled to find another vehicle in the clearing. A battered gray SUV half hidden by the pines. I approached warily, calling out, "Hello?" Over by my RV stood 2 people, Eva and Nick Santiago, as they introduced themselves. Eva was in her early 30s, with curly black hair and an air of quiet confidence. Nick was stockier, also around 30-something, and had the tired eyes of someone who'd spent too many hours behind a computer. They explained they had been hiking on a lesser-known trail system and lost their way. When they saw my RV, they assumed they'd found an official campsite. Their SUV was parked not far up the logging road. Normally, I would have been fine with company, but something about them felt off. Eva kept glancing around as if looking for someone else, and Nick's eyes darted to the smallest movement among the trees. But they seemed nice enough, just a bit spooked. They said they'd come across weird dancing lights at night, and they both claimed to have heard a humming that made their fillings vibrate. My stomach tightened at the similarities. I offered them a spot to camp near my RV if they preferred not to drive back down the treacherous road at dusk. They agreed. Perhaps I was subconsciously craving human contact after the night's strange experience. The 3 of us set about gathering firewood, though they seemed inexperienced. Nick asked a few too many personal questions. Was I married? Did I travel alone? How often did I keep in touch with family? It could have been casual conversation, but it gave me the creeps. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. As evening fell, I tried to start a fire in the old ring near Greta, but it was strangely difficult. The tinder refused to catch, and the wood hissed as if waterlogged, despite being relatively dry. After repeated attempts, we got a small flame going, but the firelight itself looked pale, almost ghostly. I blamed it on weird chemicals in the wood or damp pine sap. We chatted for a while. Eva admitted that she and Nick were kind of on the run from their old lives. She laughed it off as just needing a big break from city pressures. She never specified which city. Nick said something about being tired of the noise, which resonated with my own mission, though he wouldn't elaborate. The conversation always circled back to the lights behind the pines. They asked if I'd seen them. I mentioned the flickers I noticed at 3 a.m. They exchanged a glance I couldn't interpret. Around 9 p.m., I called it a night. I had some reading to do on my laptop regarding the logbook, and they set up a small tent about 30 yards away. I noticed they didn't have much gear. No sleeping bags, no camping stove, just the tent and a couple of water bottles. Odd for a pair claiming to have been hiking extensively. But maybe they'd packed light or left gear in the SUV. Back in Greta, I read through the ranger's logbook more thoroughly. There were references to missing hikers, unexplained lights, and illusions. One line stood out. He took Bob's face for a night. I know it wasn't Bob. They mimic voices. They feed on memory. My stomach clenched. This was no random ghost story. It sounded like some sort of identity-stealing monster. I was so rattled I barely managed to fall asleep. At around 2 a.m., I was awakened by the mechanical hum again, louder than before. I slid out of bed, heart pounding, and peered out the window. The clearing was bathed in a pale, bluish glow streaming through the pines. It moved like a living curtain, flickering in stripes of cobalt and white. Something about the motion was hypnotic, a gentle, beckoning wave. Then I noticed someone standing just inside the tree line, far from the glow. A small figure, a child, by the height. I could make out bare feet and hair that hung in tattered locks. The child gazed toward my RV. My chest tightened with dread. I wiped condensation from the window, but by the time I looked again, the child was gone. The humming subsided moments later. Shaken, I tried to calm my racing heart. Perhaps Ava and Nick had a child and they hadn't told me? No, that made no sense. They never mentioned one. And that child looked far too unkempt, wearing clothes that seemed torn or soiled. I resolved to ask them in the morning. I slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of a swirling aurora that whispered my name. When dawn finally arrived, I hobbled outside to find Eva rummaging around the edges of the clearing, as if searching for something. Nick was nowhere to be seen. She jumped when I greeted her, her eyes bloodshot. She said Nick had gone off to gather wood. That gave me pause. There was plenty of wood lying around near camp, but I didn't question her too hard. Instead, I asked if they had a child with them. She frowned, shook her head, and asked me what I meant. I described the figure I saw. She stared off into the trees, face pale, and muttered, "We saw a boy once, a few days ago, but he wouldn't speak to us." Then she abruptly changed the subject, asking if I had coffee. I brewed some in Greta's small coffee maker. We tried to chat normally, but the conversation lagged. She sipped the coffee, tapping her foot anxiously. After an hour, Nick still hadn't returned. Eva seemed unconcerned, which was bizarre given the strangeness of the woods. I offered to go look for him, but she shook her head, smiling too brightly. "He's fine. He does this sometimes. Wanders." The statement was suspiciously casual. As the morning wore on, I decided to do my own tasks. Refill water jugs from a stream about a half-mile away. Before leaving, I checked the time on my phone. Even though it had no signal, it should still keep track of hours. The phone displayed 2:17 p.m. That was impossible. It was maybe 10 a.m. at best. My phone's internal clock had jumped ahead. I tried turning it off and on again, but it wouldn't power up. I shrugged in frustration and strapped on my backpack. Near the stream, I encountered something that made my skin crawl. Footprints in the mud that looked exactly like mine, down to the worn patterns. They led from the bank deeper into the woods, well away from camp. Yet, I'd never walked that path. My mind raced with potential explanations. Was it just someone wearing boots like mine? Highly unlikely. The footprints also matched my stride. Anxiety twisted in my gut. I returned to camp to find Eva rummaging in my RV. She jumped when I opened the door, nearly dropping the tin of instant coffee she was holding. She stammered an apology, saying she was just looking for some sugar. Something in my body told me I needed to maintain a safe distance. I asked if Nick was back yet. Eva shook her head. Her eyes glinted with an odd reflection, as if she'd been crying or had water in them. She was smiling in a way that didn't reach her cheeks. It put me on edge. I reached for my backpack, rummaging for my phone to check if it was still dead. It was. Meanwhile, she hovered near the driver's seat, fiddling with the keys in the ignition. Nervousness flared in me. "Looking for something?" I asked lightly. She just coughed and mumbled something about needing to run the heater, but it was warm outside. My heart thudded. It felt like she was scoping the RV for vulnerabilities. Part of me wanted to ask her to leave, but I was too polite or too intimidated. Throughout that afternoon, Eva paced around the campsite, eyeing the trees. She checked her watch often, then muttered curses under her breath when it had flickered or reset. I tried to appear calm while keeping Greta locked. Still, I felt uneasy. In the late afternoon, Nick finally emerged from the woods carrying a small bundle of damp sticks. His hair was matted with pine needles, and there was a distant, glazed look in his eyes. "Everything okay?" I called as he entered the clearing. Nick gave a lopsided grin. "Sure," he replied, but he kept blinking rapidly, like he was trying to recall something. He turned to Ava, who stared him down with an intensity that made me think of two predators sizing each other up. Then she smiled and rushed to his side, acting relieved. The abrupt shift in her demeanor was unsettling. When we lit the fire that evening, once again a difficult process, the flames burned with an odd, greenish tint at the edges, similar to how copper wire affects a fire's color. We joked about the wood containing minerals, but I sensed none of us believed that explanation. After an awkward dinner of canned goods, we turned in. I locked Greta's door from inside, feeling a pang of guilt at the thought of leaving Eva and Nick out there if something dangerous prowled the woods. But my instincts screamed that I needed protection. The mechanical hum was absent at first, so I hoped maybe it was gone for good. That hope shattered around midnight when I jolted awake to an intense vibration that rattled dishes in the RV. The hum had grown deafening, like standing under high-voltage power lines. I scrambled to the window, flinging open the curtain, and nearly dropped to my knees in shock. The entire tree line was alive with shifting blue and white ribbons of light. They arced from branch to branch, forming sinuous shapes. For a moment, I stared, hypnotized. Then I saw movement just outside, a child with wide, unblinking eyes, hovering near the RV steps. He wore dirty shorts and no shoes, his hair a tangled mess. He lifted his hand and pressed it against Greta's side window. I wanted to yell, to ask if he needed help, but my voice caught in my throat. As I watched, he slowly withdrew his hand, revealing a streak of glowing residue, a faint phosphorescence on the glass. Then he slipped into the swirling lights, vanishing behind the pines. My rational mind tried to protest. Children don't glow, they don't appear and vanish. But my senses told me the impossible was happening anyway. Summoning courage, I grabbed a flashlight and cracked open Greta's door, scanning the clearing. The hum vibrated through my bones, disorienting me. The child was gone. However, I saw Eva standing on the far side of the clearing, near her tent, staring into the forest. She was muttering to herself, though I couldn't make out words over the hum. Nick was nowhere in sight. Then she turned, and for an instant, her eyes were ringed with the same glow I'd seen in the pines. I slammed Greta's door shut, heart pounding. Everything about their story reeked of a lie. Were they working with this phenomenon? Or were they as much victims as I was? I tried to sleep again, but only managed fitful dozing. Near dawn, I glimpsed movement outside. Peeking out, I saw Nick crawling into Eva's tent. Something about him was different. The way he moved, as if trying to mimic a human gait but not quite succeeding. His arms jerked stiffly, and his head swiveled too far. My stomach lurched with primal fear. In the morning, I forced myself to approach them. The campfire ring was cold, no sign that either of them had used it since last night. Their tent was zipped up. I called out, "Hey, everything all right?" No answer. Eventually, Eva unzipped the tent flap and emerged. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. When I asked about Nick, she claimed he was asleep. Then she said a strange thing. He came back to me last night. I pressed for clarity. He came back from gathering wood or something else? She avoided my gaze. No, just he needed to go for a walk. Her nervous smile and too long pause told me she was lying. A wave of dread washed over me. That afternoon, the child reappeared briefly, lurking near a collapsed tree about 50 yards from my sight. I marched over, determined to confirm if he was human. But as I approached, he darted behind the trunk. When I rounded it, no one was there. Instead, I found something that made me recoil. My own phone, lying in the dirt, cracked and lifeless. That phone had been in Greta just hours ago, or so I'd thought. Confused, I checked my pockets. My phone was gone. The child must have taken it, or something had. Before I could process that, I spotted a piece of blue cloth snagged on a branch, faintly shimmering as if coated in the same phosphorescent residue. Shaken, I returned to the RV. I found Eva rummaging in my cooler, though I'd locked Greta before I left. She jumped back guiltily, muttering an incoherent excuse about needing water. My supplies had started to rot. Bread covered in fuzzy mold, fruit blackened, meats gone rancid. My frustration boiled over. "What are you two even doing here?" I demanded. She looked at me with wide eyes, tears brimming. "We're lost," she insisted. Then she wiped her cheeks. "No, that's not it. It's calling us." "Calling you? The lights?" She shook her head and whispered, "Everything is wrong here." Before I could press for details, she bolted out of the RV, letting the door slam behind her. By now, my mind was on high alert. I needed to leave, and soon. But that was easier said than done. Greta's tires had gone mysteriously flat, all 4 of them. Upon closer inspection, they were slashed with neat cuts. Ava and Nick, or something else. Either way, I wasn't driving out of there unless I fixed them. Problem was, I only had 1 spare, not 4. Desperate for a plan, I decided I'd take a chance on the old fire tower's vantage point. Maybe, from higher up, I could see a better route to hike out or find a road. The tower's precariousness was less terrifying than the alternative. Being stuck in the clearing at night, awaiting the hum and the lights. So, just before dusk, I grabbed rope, a flashlight, and my backpack with what little food remained unspoiled. I approached Eva and Nick's tent to let them know. They didn't respond, though I heard low voices from within. I left them alone. Slipping through the pines, I reached the tower as evening shadows stretched across the forest floor. The structure swayed in the wind. Half the steps were missing, rust flaking off the metal. I tested the first few rungs carefully, then climbed. Fear of heights knotted my stomach, but fear of staying in that clearing was worse. Halfway up, a rung gave way. I caught myself just in time, adrenaline surging. Finally, I hauled on to the main platform near the top. The view was breathtaking in a grim sort of way. Endless, dark pines, ridges, and valleys. Somewhere far off, I could see a hint of the main road, but it was miles away. As I peered into the distance, I spotted blue-white flickers dancing deep in the forest to the north, the same kind I'd seen at night. The sun was setting, painting the sky in pink and orange, and the dancing lights looked almost unnatural against that backdrop. Inside the tower's half-fallen roof, I found evidence of past rangers. Old chairs, a broken radio, soggy notebooks. One corner was lined with pinned photographs. I almost dismissed them until I saw my face in one of them. I nearly dropped my flashlight. The photo showed me in front of Greta in the same clearing, but from an angle outside my RV. Shocked, I realized someone, or something, had been photographing me. Another photo showed me asleep in my bunk, the vantage point looking in through Greta's window. I recoiled. How was that even possible? Each photograph was labeled with dates, though they made no sense. Some were from a month before I ever arrived, some from days in the future. Chills coursed through me. On a small table, I found a dusty Polaroid camera with black slime around the lens. It reeked of ozone and rot. That's when I heard footsteps on the metal steps. My stomach twisted with dread. I ducked behind the partial wall, turning off my flashlight. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a harsh rasping sound, like heavy breathing or labored wheezing. Slowly, a figure climbed into view, stepping onto the tower platform. My heart thundered. It was Nick, or at least it looked like him. His head pivoted too far to one side, and his eyes gleamed with that faint, unnatural luminescence. He glanced around, then spoke in a strangled voice that sounded half like Nick, half like static. "Kyle, are you up here? It's all right, let's talk." Every instinct told me to remain silent. He moved toward the pinned photographs, shining a small flashlight across them. His voice came again, low and uneven. "They don't matter. They're just memories. They feed on them." A giggle rose in his throat, a chilling staccato of forced mirth. I inched backward, trying not to make a sound. My hand found the rope in my backpack. If I had to, I could lash it to the tower's railing and climb down the outside framework. It was insane, but no more insane than letting him, or it, find me. Nick's breathing grew louder, an unsteady gurgle. Then he whispered, "Eva couldn't hold it together. She's with him now, part of him. You'll be too." His flashlight paused on a photo that showed me leaning out of Greta's window, apparently taken from the woods. "You'll be so happy, Kyle," he muttered. "You'll feel no pain." I tried to keep my panic in check. Slowly, I attached the rope to the sturdiest piece of metal I could find. Nick's flashlight beam shifted. It grazed my hiding spot. I sucked in a breath, pressing myself against the tower wall. My mind raced. Should I confront him, push him off? My fists clenched. But that horrifying hum began to build, so faint I could barely hear it, but enough to shake my bones. Nick inhaled sharply, as if receiving a signal. "Fine," he rasped. "We'll find you soon." He turned and descended, footsteps echoing on the rungs. When his shape vanished from sight, I swallowed my terror, climbed over the railing, and began a slow, dangerous descent on the outside of the tower, using the rope. Every bounce of my feet against the tower's crossbeam sent rust raining down. By the time I was 10 feet from the ground, my arms were shaking from strain. My foot slipped on a slick patch of moss, and I slammed my hip into the metal. Somehow, I managed to hold on. I dropped the last few feet to the ground, rolling to break my fall. Pain flared in my shoulder, but nothing seemed broken. Immediately, I heard motion in the woods, a thrashing or scuttling. Fearing it was Nick, I ducked behind a tree, peering around. In the dim twilight, I saw something flicker. A boy again? Yes, just like before. He crouched behind a stump, eyes reflecting that faint glow. My phone was in his hand, or what looked like my phone, though it sparked with small arcs of blue electricity. He stared at me for a moment, then scrambled away. The humming in my skull intensified, as if drawn to his presence. I realized I could not go back to camp, not with Nick lurking around and possibly Eva too. My best bet was to circle wide, collect a few essential supplies from Greta, and attempt to hike out. The main road was far, but I had enough water for a day if I rationed carefully. The risk of nighttime travel was huge, but staying put seemed worse. I started weaving through the trees, hoping to approach the campsite from a safer angle. As I neared the clearing, I caught glimpses of the flickering blue light. It seemed to be centered on my RV. Heart hammering, I inched closer until I could see the clearing edge. Greta's interior lights were on, though I was sure I'd left them off. The windows glowed with that same eerie hue. Then I glimpsed a shape moving inside. My mind conjured images of the child, or Nick, or something else entirely. I tried to approach unnoticed, stepping carefully. Then a voice hissed near my ear, "Kyle!" I spun around to see Ava, or something wearing her face, crouched behind a tree. Her eyes were wide with pinpoint pupils. She reached out a hand, silent tears tracing her cheeks, and whispered, "Help me. I can't remember my last name. I can't remember my mother's face. It's devouring me." Part of me wanted to run. Another part recognized genuine agony in her voice. "Ava?" I managed. "What's happening to you?" She clutched my sleeve, her nails biting into my skin. "The lights, they feed on your mind. Nick, he came back wrong, Kyle. I don't know if it's even Nick, or if Nick is buried inside. We tried to leave, but the Aurora man, the legend, he's real." Her eyes flitted around. "You have to destroy his source, or you'll never escape." I had no idea what source meant. Was it the swirling lights, or something more tangible? As we spoke, the hum escalated, pressing on my eardrums. "Eva," I said softly, "come with me. We can get out if we move now." She shook her head, tears falling. "It's too late for me," she whispered. "I can already feel holes in my memory. Last week is gone. My wedding day is gone. Any second I'll forget who you are or who I am." She kissed my hand, a bizarre, desperate gesture. "I wish we had more time." Suddenly, she jolted upright, her expression flattening. Her face smoothed out, as if all emotion drained away. Her lips curled into a distant smile. She turned her gaze to me and said in a hollow voice, "You should come with us. We can show you everything. It's beautiful." I realized the Eva I'd been speaking to was gone again. Something else peered from behind her eyes. I yanked my arm away, stumbling back. She reached for me, but I dodged. Without a word, she turned and ran into the trees incredibly fast until the darkness swallowed her. I stood there, trembling. My plan to retrieve supplies from the RV was suicide if someone, or something, was inside. But I needed at least a flashlight and some food to survive a trek out of here. Gathering my courage, I crept toward Greta's passenger side. The interior glowed with shifting bands of bluish light. I risked a quick peek through a side window. I had to stifle a gasp. In the driver's seat sat the boy, faced away from me, rummaging in the glove box. Wisps of light coiled around his body, and the hum resonated from within his small frame. He turned slightly, letting me glimpse half his face. His eyes were mirror-like, reflecting the swirl of cosmic color. He pulled out my spare set of RV keys, which I normally kept hidden. Then he held them up as though examining them in awe. My breath caught in my throat. This was impossible, illogical, yet it was real. When he turned to exit the RV, I ducked around the corner, flattening myself against Greta's exterior. He stepped onto the ground, keys in hand. Then, like a deer sensing danger, he slowly turned his head in my direction. I pressed my back against the metal, willing my heartbeat to slow. The hum grew thunderous for a moment, then receded. Footsteps on the pine needles drifted away. I dared a peek around the back. The boy was gone, and the glow inside had vanished with him. Greta's lights were dark again, though my interior overhead switches were clearly flipped on. I realized that nothing made sense with normal electricity. Seizing my chance, I sprinted the few steps to Greta's open door. Inside, the air felt charged, prickling the hair on my arms. I snatched whatever supplies I could: flashlights, first aid kit, a water jug, a small stash of granola bars that didn't appear rotted yet. My laptop screen was cracked, and the entire system was offline. My phone was missing from where I'd left it. The child had taken it, or it had been magically transported, who knew? As I was about to leave, I heard Nick's voice outside, softly calling, "Kyle, we can help fix your tires, where are you?" I swallowed a whimper, scanning the interior for a weapon. My gaze landed on a hatchet I'd stowed near the passenger seat. It would have to do. Gripping it, I slipped out the opposite side door, scurrying around the RV to avoid Nick's approach. Crouched behind Greta, I listened as Nick's footsteps came closer. He paused. "Kyle, come on," he coaxed, voice layered with an unnatural static undertone. "We can't do this alone." Then he mumbled, "Eva's done. She's with him now." The last phrase ended in a giggle that set my nerves ablaze. I couldn't stay hidden forever. Summoning my courage, I quietly backed away, hoping to slip into the darkness between pines. But the forest was thick, and every step crackled with dried needles. I made it perhaps 15 yards before I heard him pivot. "There you are," he rasped. "Stay." I broke into a run, ignoring the branches that whipped my face. He tore after me, feet pounding the earth. My mind swirled with fear and rage. I had no illusions about outrunning him, not for long. As I scrambled downhill, I glimpsed a faint path that might curve back toward the ridge. Adrenaline fueled my flight. But Nick, or the thing controlling him, was fast. Too fast. Somehow, I reached a small ravine where an old stream cut through. Slipping in the loose soil, I half ran, half slid to the bottom, where shallow water trickled. Nick jumped down behind me. I spun to face him, brandishing the hatchet. My breath heaved in my chest. The swirling lights in his eyes were mesmerizing. And for a split second, I felt a tug at my memories, like some intangible force rummaging through my mind. He cocked his head at an awkward angle. "You really shouldn't fight," he said in that static-laced voice. "It's easier if you let go." He advanced, and I swung the hatchet. He dodged with alarming agility, then lunged. His hand grasped the handle, and, for a moment, we wrestled for control. In the scuffle, the blade sliced across his forearm, but no normal blood spilled. Some thick, dark fluid oozed out, giving off a faint glow in the gloom. Nick's face contorted in a silent cry. He staggered back, then stared at the wound in fascination. Slowly, he looked up at me, and a grin stretched across his lips. "We can mend. We always mend." His pupils contracted to pinpricks, shining with cold fire. With a final jerk, he let go of the hatchet, then turned and sprinted back the way we came, deeper into the forest. Panting, adrenaline roaring in my ears, I realized I was free to go. Maybe hurting him forced the entity to retreat, but my mind kept reeling. Did that prove Nick was fully taken over by something that repairs itself? I didn't want to dwell on it. I slogged upstream, trying to put distance between me and the campsite. My plan was to head for the main road, though I had no bearings in the dark. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe minutes. Time had become liquid, slipping through my fingers. The moon never rose. My watch read random nonsense. The gloom of the pines closed in like the walls of a tunnel. I tried not to imagine the child's reflection emerging from behind every tree or Nick's grin waiting around every bend. At some point, I saw a glimmer through the trees. Not the unnatural blue light, but actual flames. A fire. Could it be other campers? A rescue party? Desperate, I edged closer, ignoring the sense of dread. The glow illuminated a small clearing, revealing a battered ranger's shack I'd never known existed. The sign above the door read, "Ranger Station, Tower 4. So, there was an actual cabin, not just that metal scaffold. It looked partially collapsed, with moss covering the shingles. A fire burned in a makeshift pit out front. Next to it crouched Ava, silhouetted against the flames. Her shoulders shook like she was sobbing. My first instinct was to run away, but if she was still herself, maybe we could help each other escape. Summoning courage, I approached slowly. She saw me and rose to her feet, wiping her eyes. "You're here," she said softly. Her voice sounded more like the old Eva, not the stilted mimic I'd heard before. But her eyes glowed from the reflection of the fire, making it hard to read her true expression. I stayed several yards back, hatchet in hand. "Eva," I said, "we need to go. We can't survive here." She nodded, tears glistening. "It's too late for me. But maybe not for you." She gestured to the shack, whose door was ajar. "There's a can of gasoline inside," she said. "We tried to burn it out once, but it always comes back. If you can find the source, whatever it is, maybe fire can stop it." She turned away, face twisted in anguish. "I'm so tired of forgetting who I am." Something about her posture told me she was on the brink of losing herself again. I swallowed hard. Did I trust her? If there was gasoline, it might be my best weapon. My mind raced. If I could create a big enough blaze, maybe I could destroy the phenomenon, or at least scare it off long enough to escape. I inched past her, stepping into the shack. The interior smelled of mildew and rot. Piles of old papers lined the walls, presumably old ranger records. A rusted metal can leaned against a toppled chair, half filled with what smelled like gasoline. My heart leapt. Then I noticed a photograph pinned to the wall that made my knees go weak. It was me again. But I was wearing different clothes, standing near Greta with a forced smile on my face. A date scrawled at the bottom read, June 3rd, 2022, nearly a month in the future. Next to it was a Polaroid of me sleeping, labeled May 20th, 2022. The days matched my time in the forest, as if someone had carefully tracked me. Below, those were older photos of hikers, some from decades past, all with faintly luminescent eyes. My chest tightened. It was like a gallery of victims. With a trembling hand, I lifted the gas can. A plan formed in my mind. If the swirling lights were the source, I'd find them and set them ablaze. Or, if the tower was the source, I'd burn it. I didn't fully understand, but I had to try something. I emerged to find Eva huddled over the fire again. She didn't look up. "Eva, come with me," I insisted. "We'll make a run for it." She shook her head. Her voice was barely a whisper. "No. It needs me. It has me." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "Just get out. Don't let it have you too." Before I could respond, the humming started anew, loud as thunder. Eva jerked violently, her neck snapping to one side. She let out a guttural moan. The blue glow shimmered in the darkness beyond the clearing. A surge of fear propelled me to run. Gas can sloshing in one hand, hatchet in the other, I barreled into the forest. Behind me, Eva screamed. An agonized, primal wail that made me clamp my hands over my ears. Something else shrieked too, layering over her voice with a static-laced pitch. Then, abruptly, silence. My heart hammered, tears pricked my eyes, but I couldn't look back. Branches tore at my clothes. I tried to orient myself by the slope of the land. If I could just get to a vantage point, I might see the faint outline of the main road. The humming rose and fell, weaving in and out. Occasionally, I glimpsed blue lights flickering between the pines. They seemed to circle me, hurting me. I stumbled through a patch of briars, ignoring the thorns. Then, suddenly, the forest opened up into a broad clearing, lit by the swirl of luminous ribbons above. They hung like ghostly drapes, shifting gently, forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. In the center hovered the boy, suspended inches off the ground, hair drifting as though underwater. His eyes locked onto mine, and the hum pressed against my skull, prying at my mind. Visions flashed, My father's face, my old classroom, Greta, random childhood memories all swirling away into the boy's vacant eyes. I bit my tongue hard, the pain anchoring me. Clutching the gas can, I advanced. The boy floated closer, expression emotionless. My mind reeled with images of 1,000 lives, a kaleidoscope of stolen memories. I realized this phenomenon wasn't just a creature, it was a collector, a devourer. It had eaten Nick, Eva, maybe the Rangers, and countless others, storing their faces, gleaning their voices. The boy was just one of its many guises. Gritting my teeth, I yanked the gas can open, splashing the contents in a wide arc. The fumes burned my nostrils. The boy tilted his head, uncomprehending, or maybe mocking. I fumbled for my lighter, flicking it. At first, the flame refused to catch in the swirling wind. Then a spark took hold. I hurled the small flame onto the gasoline-soaked ground, praying it would ignite. A whoosh of fire burst upward, blazing orange against the blue luminescence. For an instant, the boy's face twisted in surprise or fear. The flames licked hungrily at the ribbons of light, and I let out a ragged cry of triumph. The hum became a shriek, high-pitched enough to make my eyes water. The ribbons of light convulsed, fragmenting into wild patterns. I felt a surge of heat as the fire roared, flames dancing among the pines. Sparks flew into the canopy, threatening to start a larger forest fire. Still, the swirling aurora persisted, but it was clearly distressed. The boy's outline flickered. I seized the moment and ran, stumbling past the edge of the clearing as the flames spread. Behind me, I heard crackling and popping. The hum spiked, then faded. It felt like the creature was shriveling under the onslaught of heat. Had I actually heard it? Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted. My lungs burned, my leg muscles screaming. I had no sense of direction. The only guiding principle was to get away from that clearing. Eventually, I must have crossed some threshold of the phenomenon's territory, because the humming lessened, the air felt clearer, and my thoughts sharpened. In the distance, I heard the faint roar of a large vehicle. A road. Adrenaline pushed me forward. I followed the noise until I stumbled out of the forest onto a narrow asphalt lane, nearly colliding with a green pickup truck. The driver slammed the brakes, and I collapsed in front of the headlights, panting, sooty and half-mad with terror. He rushed out, stammering a million questions. I tried to explain, but only fragments came out. Lights, forest, people, possessed. He helped me into his truck, gave me water, and said the next ranger station was about 20 minutes down the road. I clung to that hope, praying it was real this time. At the ranger station, I recounted my nightmare to a pair of baffled officers. They found me half delirious with dehydration and shock. They radioed about a possible forest fire near Borden Mountain. A crew was dispatched. I was loaded into an ambulance. As I pulled away, I glimpsed the tall pines receding into the distance, the sky above them eerily calm. No swirling aurora, no hum, just silent trees. The final image that haunted me was the reflection in the ambulance window. My eyes shining too brightly, flickering for just an instant with the same faint luminescence I'd seen in Nick and Eva. A lingering piece of that forest had followed me. I spent days in the hospital, half expecting the humming to return. It never did. The rangers reported that they contained a small blaze near an unofficial campsite, but found no bodies, no sign of Ava or Nick, and no sign of any child. My RV, Greta, was discovered with slashed tires and extensive interior damage. They towed it to a lot in a nearby town. The entire event was written off as a tragic case of a lost hiker. The official statement said I probably panicked, started a fire by mistake, and hallucinated the rest. I know better. Whatever I encountered wasn't human and wasn't benign. I like to believe I dealt it a blow with that fire, but I still dream about the aurora's flickers. I wake, convinced I hear that mechanical hum outside my bedroom window, or see a small child's silhouette standing by my closet door. In those dreams, I can't remember my own name, or where I live, or the faces of the people I love. It's as if something is slowly taking my memories, one nightmare at a time. I've told my story to a few close friends. Some believe me, most don't. But I can't stop telling it because if that phenomenon still lingers in those pines, if it survived the flames, someone else might stumble across it one day. Someone else might be drawn to the hush of the remote forest, the promise of solitude, and that same hush might claim them the way it almost claimed me. If you ever find yourself alone in Savoy Mountain State Forest or any other forgotten corner of the world, and you hear a soft humming in the night, or see ribbons of light dancing among the trees, please run. Because if you don't, you might never remember who you were before it took you.